She wasn't supposed to be chosen. Not anymore. Not after her family's name became synonymous with failure and her dowry evaporated like morning fog. But when Eleanor Vale stood in the center of that glittering ballroom and announced to 300 witnesses that Lydia Hale was engaged to her son, the Duke of Ravenscroft himself, Lydia's carefully constructed invisibility shattered like crystal against marble. The problem? Lydia had never spoken to the Duke, had never even been introduced. And the bigger problem? She couldn't afford to say no. This is a story about a woman who learned to disappear, a man who refused to be manipulated, and the lie that nearly destroyed them both. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Because what you're about to hear isn't just about deception. It's about what happens when survival becomes something far more dangerous. The Ashworth estate smelled like old money and older secrets. Lydia Hale stood near the east wall of the ballroom, positioned precisely where the light didn't quite reach, watching the glittering mass of London's elite swirl past her like she was furniture. Not ignored exactly, just not seen. There was a difference, and she'd learned to navigate it with the precision of a surgeon. Her dress was last season's silk, altered twice to hide the wear at the seams. Her gloves were borrowed. Her jewelry was her mother's, the few pieces they hadn't sold yet. But her posture was impeccable, her expression serene, and if you didn't look too closely, you might mistake her for someone who still mattered. She'd gotten very good at not being looked at closely. Still haunting the periphery, I see. Lydia didn't flinch. She'd heard Catherine Willoughby approach. The woman wore enough perfume to announce herself 3 rooms away. Still confusing volume with substance, I see, Lydia replied without looking at her. Catherine's laugh was sharp. At least I'm invited to these things for reasons other than pity. Is that what they're calling it now? Lydia took a measured sip of champagne she couldn't afford to replace if she spilled it. I thought your father's shipping contracts with Lord Ashworth were just good business. The barb landed. Catherine's smile tightened and she swept away in a rustle of overpriced taffeta. Small victories. Lydia collected them like other women collected calling cards. She'd been doing this for 18 months now, attending events she wasn't truly welcome at, maintaining connections that frayed a little more with each passing season, pretending the Hale name still carried weight when everyone knew her father's investments had collapsed so spectacularly that 3 other families had been pulled down with them. The whispers had been immediate. The distance, even faster. People who'd called themselves friends suddenly had prior commitments. Invitations dwindled. Her younger sister Margaret's debut had been modest. Painfully modest. And every night, Lydia lay awake calculating how many months they had before they'd have to sell the house, before Margaret's chance at a decent marriage disappeared entirely, before their mother's health, already fragile, crumbled under the weight of social extinction. 6 months, maybe, if they were careful. 4 if they weren't. You're thinking too loudly, a voice murmured beside her. Lydia turned to find Thomas Blackwood, one of the few people who still spoke to her without performing charity. He was the 3rd son of a baron, which meant he had a title but needed money as badly as she did. Mutual desperation made for honest friendships. I'm thinking at an entirely appropriate volume, she said. Your jaw's doing that thing. He gestured vaguely at her face. The thing where you're calculating odds. I'm always calculating odds. I know. It's exhausting to watch. But he smiled when he said it, and Lydia felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. How long are you planning to stay tonight? Until I've been seen by enough people to matter, but not so long that I look desperate. She paused. Another 43 minutes. Specific. I'm a specific person. Thomas shook his head, but he was still smiling. You know, most people who've been through what you have would have left London by now, found some country estate to hide in, licked their wounds in private. Most people have country estates to hide in. Lydia kept her voice light, but the words tasted bitter. They'd sold the country house 8 months ago. Besides, retreating is just another word for surrendering. And Lydia Hale doesn't surrender. Lydia Hale can't afford to. It was the truth, plain and unvarnished. She'd become very good at truth lately, when it suited her purposes. Lies required maintenance, required energy she didn't have to spare. Better to be honest about the parts that didn't matter and save the deception for when it counted. Not that she was lying about anything important, not yet, but she was prepared to. had a whole arsenal of carefully constructed half-truths ready to deploy if necessary. Because that's what survival looked like now. Strategic honesty and tactical deception, and knowing exactly which was which. "Have you seen the Duke of Ravenscroft yet?" Thomas asked, and something in his tone made Lydia's attention sharpen. "Should I have? He arrived an hour ago. The Dowager Duchess is with him." Thomas lowered his voice. "Eleanor Vale herself. The woman who hasn't attended a social function in 3 years." That was unusual. Eleanor Vale was a legend, a woman who'd married into one of England's oldest titles and proceeded to run her household, her estates, and her son's political career with an iron fist wrapped in expensive gloves. She didn't attend balls. She held court in her own home and made other people come to her. "Why is she here?" Lydia asked. "No one knows. But she's been watching the room like a hawk sizing up prey," and Thomas stopped abruptly. Oh hell. What?" "She's looking at you." Lydia's first instinct was to assume Thomas was joking. Her second was to follow his gaze across the ballroom. Eleanor Vale stood near the orchestra dais, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a spine that could cut glass. She wore black silk that probably cost more than Lydia's entire wardrobe, and she was, in fact, staring directly at Lydia with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for hunting accidents or political scandals. "Why would she be looking at me?" Lydia kept her voice steady even as her heart started doing something irregular. "We've never even been introduced." "Well, she's coming over here, so you're about to be." Thomas, but he was already melting into the crowd with the self-preservation instinct of someone who recognized trouble and wanted no part of it. Traitor. Lydia straightened her spine and did what she'd been doing for 18 months. She prepared to perform. Pleasant expression, neutral posture, the kind of polite interest that suggested she was flattered by the attention but not desperate for it. She was very, very desperate for it. But Eleanor Vale didn't need to know that. The Dowager Duchess moved through the crowd like water parting around stone, and people stepped aside without even seeming to realize they were doing it. Power, real power, had that effect. When she finally stopped in front of Lydia, close enough that the scent of expensive perfume and older money was almost overwhelming, Lydia dropped into a curtsy that was precisely as deep as protocol required, and not an inch deeper. "Your Grace," she murmured. "Miss Hale." Eleanor's voice was cool, measured, and gave away absolutely nothing. "You're exactly as described." That was not a normal greeting. Lydia straightened, meeting the older woman's gaze with what she hoped was polite confusion rather than growing alarm. "I'm flattered you've heard of me, though I can't imagine in what context." "Can't you?" Eleanor's eyes, pale blue and sharp as cut glass, traveled over Lydia's altered dress, borrowed gloves, and carefully maintained composure with an assessment that felt surgical. "You're either remarkably modest or an excellent liar. I haven't decided which." The floor felt suddenly unstable beneath Lydia's feet. This wasn't how these conversations went. Society matrons didn't approach fallen debutantes with cryptic comments and intense scrutiny. They ignored them, or worse, pitied them openly. Eleanor Vale was doing neither. "I'm afraid I don't understand," Lydia said carefully. "No, I don't imagine you do." Eleanor glanced around the ballroom, and something flickered across her face. Calculation, maybe, or decision. "Walk with me, Miss Hale. There's something we need to discuss." It wasn't a request, and Lydia, who'd spent 18 months learning to read power dynamics like music, knew she couldn't refuse without causing a scene that would damage her reputation further. So she inclined her head and let Eleanor lead her toward the terrace doors, away from the crowd, away from witnesses. The night air was cool against her skin, and the noise of the ball became muffled behind heavy glass. They were alone out here, or as alone as anyone could be at a society function. A few other couples had sought the terrace for air or privacy, but they were distant shadows in the lamplight. Eleanor walked to the stone balustrade and stood looking out over the gardens. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet enough that Lydia had to step closer to hear. "My son needs a wife." Lydia blinked. "I see. Congratulations?" "Don't be obtuse, Miss Hale. It doesn't suit you." Eleanor turned, and in the dim light, her expression was impossible to read. "Adrian has refused every suitable candidate I've presented for the past 5 years. He claims he's too occupied with his estates and his seat in Parliament to concern himself with marriage. But the truth is simpler. He's stubborn, proud, and convinced he doesn't need anyone. That's not uncommon in powerful men, Lydia said slowly, wondering where this was going and why Eleanor Vale was telling her any of it. No, but it becomes a problem when political enemies start using his unmarried status as a weapon. Questions about his stability, his commitment to producing an heir, whispers that perhaps there's some impediment. Eleanor's mouth thinned. Absurd, of course, but damaging nonetheless. I'm sorry to hear that, Your Grace, but I'm not sure why you're telling me, because I'm going to announce your engagement to him, tonight. The world tilted. Lydia actually grabbed the balustrade for support, her fingers closing on cold stone as her brain tried to process what she'd just heard. You're going to what? Announce your engagement. To my son, the Duke of Ravenscroft. Eleanor said it like she was discussing the weather. In approximately 10 minutes, when the orchestra breaks and Lord Ashworth makes his customary toast. But Lydia's voice came out strangled. But that's insane. I've never even met him. We've never spoken. You can't just... I can. I am. Eleanor's gaze was steady. And you're not going to refuse. The sheer audacity of it crashed over Lydia like a wave. Yes, I am. Of course I am. You can't announce an engagement that doesn't exist. The moment your son hears about it, he'll deny everything. And then where will we be? You'll look delusional, and I'll look like a desperate social climber who concocted an elaborate lie. Adrian won't deny it. How could you possibly? Because I raised him. Eleanor's voice cut through Lydia's protest like a blade. I know my son better than he knows himself. He won't publicly contradict me, not in front of 300 witnesses. It would humiliate us both, and whatever else Adrian is, he's not cruel. He'll play along, at least initially. And then what? Lydia's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. When the initial shock wears off, when he demands an explanation, then you'll give him one. Eleanor stepped closer, and now there was something fierce in her expression, something almost desperate. You'll tell him the truth, that I approached you with a proposition, that I offered you a bargain. What bargain? 3 months. You pretend to be engaged to my son for 3 months. You attend functions together. You're seen in public. You convince society that Adrian Vale is a settled, committed man, ready to lead. And in exchange, Eleanor paused. I pay off your father's debts, every single one of them. Your family's reputation is restored. Your sister has a London season with my sponsorship. Your mother receives the medical care she needs. Lydia stopped breathing. She must have, because the next thing she was aware of was the desperate pull of air into her lungs, and Eleanor watching her with something that might have been sympathy if it had come from someone capable of the emotion. How do you know about my mother? Lydia's voice was barely a whisper. I make it my business to know things. Eleanor's tone was matter-of-fact. Your mother's illness, your sister's limited prospects, the creditors circling your household like vultures. I know all of it, Miss Hale. And I know that in approximately 4 months, you'll have nothing left, not even the pretense of respectability. It was true, all of it. And hearing it laid out so clinically, so precisely, made Lydia feel exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the cool night air. This is blackmail, she managed. This is opportunity, Eleanor corrected. I'm offering you a solution to every problem you currently face. All I'm asking in return is 3 months of your time and a convincing performance. Your son will never agree to this. He won't have a choice. Once I make the announcement, the scandal of denying it would be worse than simply going along with the charade. Eleanor's expression was granite. Adrian is pragmatic above all else. He'll recognize the logic. And after 3 months? The engagement ends amicably. You and Adrian decide you're not suited. No one's reputation suffers. In fact, you'll be the object of sympathy. The woman almost married to a duke. You'll have suitors lining up. It was clever. Horrifyingly clever. And it solved every single problem Lydia had been losing sleep over for the past 18 months. Her mother could get treatment. Margaret could have a real season. The debts would disappear. They could keep the house, keep their name, keep their dignity. All she had to do was lie. Extensively. To everyone. Including a man she'd never met who apparently had no idea he was about to become engaged. I need to think about this, Lydia said. You have 30 seconds. Eleanor pulled a small watch from her sleeve. After that, I'm making the announcement with or without your cooperation, but it will go considerably smoother if you're prepared to play your part. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Eleanor's gaze was unwavering. 20 seconds, Miss Hale. What's it going to be, survival or pride? And there it was. The choice laid bare. Lydia had spent 18 months being strategic, being careful, being proud. She'd held on to her dignity when everyone else had written her off. She'd refused to beg, refused to scheme, refused to compromise herself for the sake of social advancement. But this wasn't advancement. This was survival. Her mother's survival, Margaret's future, her family's entire existence. And Eleanor Vale was right about one thing. Lydia couldn't afford pride anymore. 10 seconds. Lydia closed her eyes, thought of her mother's last medical bill, the one she'd had to negotiate down to almost nothing. Thought of Margaret's face when they'd had to cancel the dress fitting for her debut ball. Thought of the house she'd grown up in, the one that had been in their family for 4 generations, the one they were going to lose. 5 seconds. She opened her eyes. I'll do it, she said, but we need terms, clear terms, in writing. Eleanor's smile was sharp and approving. I knew you were intelligent. We'll discuss terms tomorrow. For now, all you need to do is look surprised and delighted when I make the announcement. Can you manage that? Could she manage it? Lydia had been managing the impossible for 18 months. What was one more performance? Yes, she said. Good. Eleanor tucked her watch away and straightened her already perfect posture. Then let's return to the ballroom. And Miss Hale, do try to look at least somewhat happy. You're about to become engaged to one of the most powerful men in England. I've never even seen him. You will in about 3 minutes. Eleanor started toward the terrace doors. He's the tall one near the fireplace. Dark hair. Expression like he's mentally calculating how quickly he can leave. Despite everything, the shock, the fear, the absolute insanity of what she'd just agreed to, Lydia felt a laugh bubble up in her throat. That's really not much to go on. You'll know him when you see him. Everyone always does. They stepped back into the ballroom and the noise crashed over them like surf. The orchestra was finishing a waltz, couples swirling across the floor in a blur of silk and candlelight. Lydia let her gaze travel across the room, looking for... There, near the massive marble fireplace, standing slightly apart from the clusters of conversation, was a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same unforgiving stone as the mantel behind him. Tall, yes. Dark hair, yes. But Eleanor had failed to mention the shoulders that suggested he didn't spend all his time behind a desk, or the way he held himself with the kind of absolute certainty that came from never having to question whether he belonged somewhere. He was listening to an older gentleman drone on about something, his expression polite but distant, and even from across the room, Lydia could see the intelligence in his eyes, the way he was only giving the conversation about 30% of his attention, while the rest of his mind was clearly elsewhere. This was the Duke of Ravenscroft, Adrian Vale, the man she was about to become fake engaged to in front of 300 witnesses. He was going to hate her. She was absolutely certain of it. Lord Ashworth is about to speak, Eleanor murmured beside her. Are you ready? No, absolutely not. This was the worst idea anyone had ever had, and Lydia was about to become complicit in a lie that would either save her family or destroy what was left of her reputation. But she'd made her choice. Survival over pride. I'm ready, she said. Eleanor's hand closed on her arm, not hard, but firm. A reminder. An anchor. Remember. Surprised but delighted. Lord Ashworth was climbing onto a small platform near the orchestra, champagne glass in hand, face already flushed with drink, and the pleasure of being the center of attention. The room began to quiet, conversations trailing off as people turned to listen. My dear friends, Ashworth began, his voice carrying across the ballroom. Before the orchestra resumes, I've been asked to share some wonderful news. Lydia's pulse was thunder in her ears. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft has an announcement. The crowd parted as Eleanor released Lydia's arm and walked toward the platform with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. She climbed the steps with practiced grace, accepted Ashworth's offered hand, and turned to face the assembled guests. Her eyes found Lydia in the crowd, held there for just a moment. Then she smiled, warm, maternal, absolutely convincing, and began to speak. Thank you all for your kind attention. I know you're eager to return to the dancing, so I'll be brief. Eleanor's voice carried perfectly, trained by decades of managing rooms just like this one. It gives me great joy to announce the engagement of my son, Adrian Vale, the Duke of Ravenscroft. Lydia watched Adrian's head snap up across the room, watched comprehension and shock flicker across his features. To Miss Lydia Hale. The ballroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, the immediate buzz of 300 people trying to process the impossible. Lydia stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think, as Eleanor continued speaking over the noise. I know this comes as a surprise to many of you, as the couple has kept their understanding quite private, but Adrian has assured me of his absolute commitment, and I couldn't be more delighted to welcome Miss Hale into our family. Lydia forced herself to look across the room, to meet Adrian Vale's gaze. He was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Shock, yes, but underneath it, something sharper, something that looked dangerously close to fury. And then he smiled. It didn't reach his eyes, but it was a smile nonetheless, and he inclined his head toward her in acknowledgement even as conversations exploded around them. He was playing along, just like his mother had predicted. Lydia felt her own mouth curve into what she hoped looked like surprised joy rather than abject terror. She dropped into a small curtsy, a gesture of acknowledgement, and watched Adrian's smile sharpen into something that made her skin prickle. This was a man who didn't like being manipulated. That much was clear even from across a crowded ballroom, and she'd just become complicit in the biggest manipulation of his life. Miss Hale! Catherine Willoughby appeared at her elbow, face alight with malicious curiosity. You dark horse! When did this happen? How did this happen? Lydia's voice stuck. She cleared her throat and tried again, pulling on every ounce of composure she'd spent 18 months developing. It's all rather recent, actually. We've been getting to know each other quietly. How romantic! Another woman, Lydia thought her name was Susan something, pressed closer. The Duke is so private. We'd all but given up hope of him settling down. Well, he's full of surprises, Lydia managed. The crowd around her was growing, questions coming from all directions, and she could feel herself starting to crack under the pressure. This was supposed to be easier. She was supposed to have time to prepare, to figure out what story they were telling, to coordinate with Adrian himself before facing the wolves. But Eleanor had thrown her to them without a script, and now she was improvising wildly, trying to remember everything she'd ever learned about lying convincingly, while also monitoring Adrian's progress across the room. He was moving toward her. People were congratulating him, clapping him on the shoulder, and he was accepting it all with that same sharp smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Getting closer, cutting through the crowd with the kind of determined purpose that made Lydia's stomach drop. And then he was there, right in front of her, tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. Up close, Adrian Vale was even more imposing, dark eyes that missed nothing, a mouth set in a line that suggested he was holding back something cutting, the kind of presence that made people step back without realizing they were doing it. Miss Hale, he said, and his voice was deep and controlled and absolutely furious beneath the pleasant surface. What a surprise. Your Grace, Lydia dropped into a curtsy that felt more like a defensive maneuver. I hope you'll forgive the unconventional nature of the announcement. Oh, I'm sure we'll have much to discuss about the unconventional nature of many things. Adrian offered his hand, and when she placed hers in it, his grip was just slightly too firm. Not painful, but definite. A warning. Perhaps we should find somewhere quieter to talk. I'm sure you have much to explain. It wasn't a suggestion. Catherine and the other women surrounding them tittered about giving the happy couple privacy, and Lydia let Adrian guide her toward the same terrace she'd occupied with Eleanor just minutes earlier. The crowd parted for them. For him, really. And she could feel hundreds of eyes tracking their movement, see the whispers starting behind raised fans and champagne glasses. The moment they were through the terrace doors and out of immediate earshot, Adrian dropped her hand like it burned. Would you care to explain, he said with terrifying calm, what the hell just happened in there? Lydia had prepared for this. Or she thought she had. But standing in front of Adrian Vale's controlled fury was different than imagining it. Your mother made me an offer, she said, deciding that honesty, or at least partial honesty, was the only strategy that might work. A business arrangement. And that arrangement involved announcing a fake engagement without my knowledge or consent? Yes. At least he appreciated directness. Some of the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. At least you're not trying to lie about it being real. That's something. He turned away, bracing his hands on the balustrade and staring out at the dark gardens. My mother has done many manipulative things over the years, but this is impressive even for her. I'm sorry. Lydia meant it. Whatever else this was, she hadn't wanted to humiliate him. If I'd had more time to think, more warning, you'd have done it anyway. Adrian glanced back at her, and his gaze was too sharp, too knowing. Because my mother offered you something you needed badly enough to agree to this insanity. Let me guess, money? Social restoration? Both? Lydia lifted her chin. Does it matter? Yes, actually. It matters quite a lot. He turned fully to face her. Because if you're doing this purely for mercenary reasons, we can end it right now. I'll walk back in there, announce it was all a misunderstanding, and deal with the fallout. The fallout would destroy both of us. I can survive it, can you? It was a fair question, and the answer was no. Lydia couldn't survive having this engagement announced and then immediately denied. She'd look like the worst kind of social climber, the type who'd invent connections to claw her way back into relevance. She'd be finished, not just her, but her entire family. Your mother said you were pragmatic, Lydia said, instead of answering directly. Was she wrong? Adrian's laugh was short and humorless. Pragmatic. That's a diplomatic way of putting it. He studied her for a long moment, and Lydia forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. What exactly did my mother offer you? That's between your mother and me. It stopped being between you and my mother the moment it became about me. His voice dropped, became dangerously soft. What did she offer you, Miss Hale? Lydia considered lying, considered deflecting, but something in Adrian's expression told her that he'd see through anything less than truth, and she needed him to believe she was being honest if this had any chance of working. She offered to pay my father's debts, Lydia said quietly, to sponsor my sister's season, to provide medical care for my mother, in exchange for 3 months of a fake engagement. Adrian was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired. And you accepted because you're desperate. I accepted because I'm practical, Lydia corrected. There's a difference. Is there? But some of the edge had left his tone. He scrubbed a hand over his face, and for the first time he looked less like an intimidating duke and more like a man who'd just had his entire evening derailed. 3 months. That's what she said. And at the end of 3 months, we part amicably. No scandal, no blame. That was the agreement. Adrian laughed again, and this time there was a hint of genuine humor in it, dark as it was. My mother thinks of everything, doesn't she? Except apparently asking my opinion on the matter. I don't think your opinion was particularly relevant to her strategy. No, I don't suppose it was. He looked at her then, really looked, and Lydia forced herself not to fidget under the scrutiny. Lydia Hale. I'll admit I didn't recognize the name when my mother announced it. Should I have? No, Lydia said. There's no reason you would. My family isn't... We're not in your circles anymore. But you were once. Once. Adrian nodded slowly, still watching her with that unnerving intensity. My mother chose you specifically. She doesn't do anything without extensive research and planning. So what is it about you, Miss Hale, that made you the perfect candidate for this scheme? It was a good question, one Lydia had been asking herself since Eleanor approached her. I suppose, she said carefully, I'm desperate enough to agree but proud enough to play the part convincingly. Your mother probably calculated that I'd see this as an opportunity rather than charity, and she was right. Desperate and proud, Adrian repeated. An interesting combination. I prefer practical and realistic. Of course you do. But he was almost smiling now, just a slight curve at the corner of his mouth. Well, Miss Hale, it seems we're engaged, at least for the next 3 months. It seems we are. Then we should probably establish some ground rules. Adrian straightened, and just like that, he was the Duke again, controlled, authoritative, absolutely in command. First, we maintain the appearance at all public functions, convincingly. No half-hearted performances. Agreed. Second, we spend exactly as much time together as necessary to sell this and not a moment more. I have work to do, and I assume you have a life of your own. such as it is. Third, Adrian paused, and something flickered in his expression. Third, when this ends, it ends cleanly. No lingering complications, no emotional entanglements, no attempting to extend the arrangement. That one stung, though Lydia wasn't entirely sure why. I'm not trying to trap you into a real marriage, if that's what you're worried about. I'm not worried, Adrian said, but his tone suggested otherwise. I'm simply being clear about expectations. Crystal clear. They stood there in the cool night air, two strangers who'd just agreed to lie to everyone they knew, and Lydia wondered, not for the first time, if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. We should return to the ballroom, Adrian said finally. People will talk if we're gone too long. People are already talking. Then let's give them something to talk about. He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Lydia took it. His sleeve was fine wool, expensive, and she could feel the solid strength of his arm beneath it. Try to look moderately happy, Miss Hale. You've just gotten engaged to a duke. You try to look moderately happy, Lydia shot back. You've just gotten engaged to a woman you didn't choose. Adrian's laugh surprised her, genuine this time, warm and unexpected. Touché. Although I'm not entirely sure either of us chose this. Your mother chose it for us. Yes, and we're going to make her regret it. Lydia glanced up at him sharply. What? Oh, we'll play our parts, Adrian said, that sharp smile returning. We'll be the perfect engaged couple, but my mother thinks she can manipulate me without consequences. She's about to learn otherwise. They stepped back into the ballroom together, and the noise swelled around them. Congratulations, well wishes, barely veiled curiosity. Adrian kept Lydia's hand tucked into his arm and smiled and accepted it all with practiced grace. But Lydia could feel the tension in his frame, could see the calculation in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. This wasn't going to be a simple 3-month performance. This was going to be war between Adrian and his mother, between Adrian and herself, between what they were pretending to be and what they actually were. And Lydia, who'd agreed to this out of desperation and necessity, had just become a weapon in a battle she didn't fully understand. Eleanor Vale found her way back to them as the evening began to wind down, her expression radiantly pleased. You're doing wonderfully, she murmured to Lydia, while Adrian was momentarily occupied by a parliamentary colleague. Much better than I'd hoped. Glad I could exceed expectations, Lydia said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Eleanor's smile didn't waver. Tomorrow afternoon, 3 o'clock. My residence. We'll discuss the details and sign the necessary documents. Don't be late, Miss Hale. Wouldn't dream of it, Your Grace. When Adrian returned, Eleanor had already glided away, and Lydia was left with the man who was now, apparently, her fiancé. She wants to see me tomorrow, Lydia said. Of course she does. She'll want to make sure you're properly prepared to play your part. Adrian's jaw was tight. She's very thorough about these things. You sound like you have experience with her schemes. 27 years of experience, Adrian said dryly. You get used to it, or you develop coping mechanisms. I've opted for the latter. What kind of coping mechanisms? The kind that involves staying as far away from her manipulations as possible. He glanced down at her, and there was something almost sympathetic in his expression. Welcome to the family, Miss Hale. You're going to hate it. I'm not actually joining your family, Lydia reminded him. This is temporary. Everything with my mother is temporary, Adrian said, until suddenly it's not. Before Lydia could ask what he meant, Catherine Willoughby descended on them again, this time with half a dozen other society women in tow, all of them eager for details and gossip and any scrap of information they could weaponize later. Lydia smiled and deflected and lied through her teeth. Beside her, Adrian did the same with the ease of long practice. They were convincing, they were perfect, they were absolutely doomed. And as the night wore on and Lydia's feet began to ache from standing in borrowed shoes and her face began to hurt from maintaining a pleasant expression, she realized something that made her stomach drop. This wasn't going to be simple survival. This wasn't going to be a clean 3-month arrangement with a tidy ending. Because Adrian Vale was intelligent, perceptive, and already looking at her like he was trying to solve a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted the answer to. And Lydia, who'd built her entire survival on being invisible, on not being looked at too closely, was now going to be scrutinized by one of the sharpest minds in London. For 3 months, they were going to have to lie to everyone. The real question was, how long before they started lying to themselves? The carriage ride home felt longer than it actually was. Lydia sat in the darkness, watching gas lamps slide past the window while her mind raced through everything that had just happened. Engaged. She was engaged to a man she'd spoken to for all of 20 minutes, most of which had been spent establishing how much they both resented the situation. Her mother was going to lose her mind. The house was dark when she arrived, except for a single lamp burning in the drawing room. Margaret would be asleep. She'd stayed home tonight, claiming a headache, but really just avoiding another event where she'd be pitied. Their mother would be in bed, her strength never lasting past 9 o'clock anymore. But someone was awake. Lydia found her father in his study, surrounded by papers he was no longer pretending to read. Edward Hale looked up when she entered, and the exhaustion in his face made her chest ache. "You're home late," he said. "Good evening?" "Interesting evening." Lydia sat down across from him, still wearing her gloves because if she started removing them, started settling in, she might lose her nerve. "Father, I need to tell you something." The wariness that crossed his face was immediate. They'd had too many difficult conversations lately for him to hear those words without bracing for impact. "What's happened?" "I'm engaged." Edward blinked. I'm sorry, what?" "To the Duke of Ravenscroft. It was announced tonight at the Ashworth Ball." The words sounded insane even as Lydia said them. His mother made the announcement. Her father just stared at her. Then he stood up, walked to the sideboard, poured himself a drink, drained it, and poured another. "I think," he said carefully, "you'd better explain that again, slowly." So Lydia did. She told him about Eleanor's approach, the bargain, the announcement. She didn't tell him about Adrian's fury or her own doubts. She made it sound strategic, reasonable, like a business arrangement they could all benefit from, which it was, except it was also the most reckless thing she'd ever agreed to. When she finished, Edward was on his third drink and looking even more exhausted than before. "Lydia," he said quietly, "what have you done?" "What I had to do." She kept her voice steady. "This solves everything, the debts, Margaret's season, Mother's medical care. At what cost?" Edward set down his glass with enough force that it cracked. "You've agreed to lie to everyone, to pretend to be engaged to a man you don't even know. What happens when this falls apart? And it will fall apart, Lydia. These schemes always do. It won't fall apart if we're careful. You're betting our entire family's future on 3 months of deception." Edward shook his head. "I never wanted this for you. Any of this. I know." And she did. Her father had spent the past 18 months drowning in guilt over the investments that had destroyed them. Lydia watching him shrink a little more each day, his confidence eroding with every creditor's letter, every social snub. But we're here now, and this is our way out. Is it? Or is it just a different kind of trap? Lydia didn't have an answer for that. She left her father in his study and climbed the stairs to her room, where she sat in the dark for a long time, still wearing her borrowed gloves, wondering if she'd just saved her family or doomed them all. Eleanor Vale's London residence was even more intimidating in daylight. Lydia arrived at precisely 3 o'clock the next afternoon, because being late would only give Eleanor more ammunition. A butler who looked like he'd been carved from disapproval led her through a maze of hallways to a private sitting room where Eleanor was waiting. "Miss Hale, punctual, I approve." Eleanor gestured to a chair across from her. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." Lydia sat. On the table between them was a stack of papers that made her stomach clench. "Contracts," Eleanor said, following her gaze. "Agreements. Protections for both parties. I don't do anything without proper documentation." "Of course you don't." Lydia reached for the papers, but Eleanor's hand covered them first. "Before we discuss terms, I need to understand something." Eleanor's gaze was sharp. "Last night you agreed to this arrangement out of desperation. Today, in the clear light of day, do you still agree? Because if you're going to back out, now is the time. Once we sign these papers, there's no retreat." It was a fair question, and Lydia had spent the entire sleepless night asking herself the same thing. "I'm not backing out," she said. "Why not?" "You've had time to think. Time to realize how difficult this will be. Most women in your position would have reconsidered by now." "Most women in my position don't have a mother who needs medical care they can't afford, or a sister whose future depends on social connections they no longer have." Lydia met Eleanor's gaze steadily. You made me an offer that solves every problem I currently face. I'd be a fool to refuse it. You'd be a fool to accept it without understanding the full scope. Eleanor pushed the papers toward her. Read these, carefully. They outline exactly what I expect from you over the next 3 months. Lydia read. And with each page, her understanding of what she'd actually agreed to became clearer and considerably more complicated. Public appearances at a minimum of 12 society functions. Weekly dinners at the Ravenscroft residence. Coordinated stories about how she and Adrian had met and fallen in love. Specific behaviors required at specific events. Language about maintaining discretion and protecting the family's reputation. It wasn't a contract, it was a script. This is very detailed, Lydia said. I don't believe in leaving things to chance. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, watching Lydia read. You'll notice the section about compensation. The payment schedule is structured. A portion released at the beginning, the remainder at the successful conclusion of the 3-month period. Lydia had noticed. She'd also noticed the clause about what constituted a successful conclusion. No public scandals, no breaches of contract, no damage to the Ravenscroft reputation. And if something goes wrong, she asked, if the engagement ends early or there's some kind of complication, then the contract is void and you receive nothing. Eleanor's voice was matter-of-fact. I'm investing considerable resources into solving your family's problems, Miss Hale. I expect results in return. You're also using me to manipulate your son. I'm providing my son with a solution to a political problem he refuses to acknowledge. Eleanor's expression didn't change. Adrian will benefit from this arrangement as much as you will, even if he's too stubborn to see it yet. He's furious with you. He's furious with me at least once a month. He'll recover. Eleanor tapped the papers. What matters is whether you can do what's required. Can you, Miss Hale? Can you stand beside my son at public functions and convince hundreds of people that you're in love with him? Can you lie that convincingly? Could she? Lydia had spent 18 months lying about her family's financial situation, about her own prospects, about whether she was fine when she absolutely wasn't. She'd gotten very good at lying. But this was different. This wasn't passive deception. This was active performance, and her audience would be looking for cracks. I can do it, Lydia said, but I need something from you first. Eleanor's eyebrow rose. You're already receiving quite a lot. I need information about Adrian, his habits, his preferences, his background. If I'm going to convince people we're in love, I need to know him well enough to make the lie believable. Lydia held Eleanor's gaze. You can't expect me to perform without preparation. A smile ghosted across Eleanor's face. Clever. Yes, I can provide that. Though I suspect you'll learn more about Adrian through direct observation than anything I could tell you. I'll take whatever advantage I can get. You're more strategic than I expected. Eleanor pulled another document from the stack. This is a brief biography. Adrian's education, political career, known associates. Memorize it. Lydia took the document, scanning the first page. Educated at Oxford. Inherited the dukedom at 21 when his father died. Served in Parliament for 6 years with a focus on agricultural reform and trade policy. Known for being intelligent, reserved, and extremely difficult to manipulate. That last part made her laugh despite herself. Something amusing? Eleanor asked. Just appreciating the irony. Lydia folded the document. You've managed to manipulate someone described as extremely difficult to manipulate. I'm his mother. I have advantages others don't. Eleanor stood, indicating the meeting was nearing its end. You'll begin attending functions with Adrian starting this week. There's a dinner at the Beaumont estate on Thursday. You'll accompany him. Does Adrian know about this? He will. I'm meeting with him this evening. Eleanor's smile was sharp. I suspect that conversation will be, spirited. That was one way to describe it. Lydia could imagine Adrian's reaction to being presented with a schedule of required public appearances with his fake fiancée. One more thing, Lydia said as she gathered her belongings. What happens at the end of 3 months? How exactly does this engagement end without damaging either of our reputations? That depends entirely on how well you perform over the next 3 months. Eleanor walked her toward the door. If you've played your part convincingly, the ending will be easy. A mutual decision that you're not suited. Perhaps Adrian's political commitments are too demanding. Perhaps you've realized you want different things. The specifics don't matter as long as the separation appears amicable and inevitable. And if I haven't played my part convincingly, then we'll have a much bigger problem to solve. Eleanor opened the door. Don't give me that problem, Miss Hale. I don't like complications. The dismissal was clear. Lydia left the Vale residence with a head full of information and a stomach full of dread, because she was starting to understand just how carefully Eleanor had planned this. The dinner at the Beaumont estate came faster than Lydia was prepared for. She spent 2 days memorizing Adrian's biography, practicing responses to questions she anticipated being asked, and trying not to think about how spectacularly this could all collapse. Margaret helped her alter another dress, deep green silk that had belonged to their mother and still fit well enough to be convincing. "You look beautiful," Margaret said, pinning the last modification. "Though I still can't believe you're actually engaged to the Duke of Ravenscroft. It's like something from a novel." If only Margaret knew how fictional it actually was. Adrian's carriage arrived at 7. Lydia descended the steps to find him waiting, looking severe and impossibly elegant in evening clothes that probably cost more than her family's remaining furniture. "Miss Hale," he said, offering his hand to help her into the carriage. "Your Grace." They sat across from each other in tense silence as the carriage pulled away. Lydia watched Adrian watching her, both of them clearly trying to figure out how to navigate this strange new dynamic. "My mother gave you the contract," Adrian said finally. "It wasn't a question." "She did, along with your complete biography." Lydia kept her tone neutral. "I'm now thoroughly informed about your education and political career." "How comprehensive of her." Adrian's jaw tightened. "And did she also inform you that I had a rather pointed conversation with her about the necessity of consulting me before scheduling my social calendar?" "I assumed that conversation happened. How pointed was it?" "Exceptionally." He leaned back against the seat, and some of the formal stiffness left his posture. "My mother has many talents, but listening isn't among them. She's decided we're attending 4 events this week. 4. I haven't attended 4 social events in a single month in the past year." "Consider it character building," Lydia said, and was rewarded with a startled laugh. "Character building? Is that what we're calling this disaster? Would you prefer elaborate deception, mutual manipulation, socially mandated performance?" All more accurate than character building. But Adrian was almost smiling now. "Tell me something, Miss Hale. Are you always this direct, or is this a special performance for my benefit?" "I'm practical," Lydia said. "We're stuck in this situation together. Pretending otherwise seems exhausting, refreshingly honest." Adrian studied her for a moment. "My mother chose well. Most women would be trying to charm me right now. You're just tolerating the situation. Most women aren't here because they desperately need money to save their families. No, most women would be here because they desperately want to become a duchess." His gaze was sharp. "You don't, do you? Want the title?" It wasn't a question, but Lydia answered anyway. "I want my mother to receive medical care. I want my sister to have a chance at a decent marriage. I want my father to stop looking like he's drowning every time I see him." She met Adrian's eyes. "The title is irrelevant." "Good." Adrian's expression was unreadable. "Because that makes this easier. We both know what this is. A transaction. No romantic delusions to complicate things." "None whatsoever." "Then let's establish some working parameters." Adrian shifted in his seat, and now he was all business. "In public, we maintain the fiction. You call me Adrian, I call you Lydia. We act like an engaged couple who are reasonably fond of each other." How fond is reasonably fond? Polite affection, perhaps the occasional shared smile. Nothing excessive. I'm not known for public displays of emotion, and suddenly becoming effusive would raise suspicions. He paused. "Can you manage polite affection?" "I've been managing it for 18 months with people I actively dislike. I think I can handle it with someone I'm merely contractually obligated to." Another laugh. This one more genuine. "We're going to get through this on sarcasm alone, aren't we?" It's either that or mutual resentment, and I suspect that's harder to maintain. The carriage slowed, and through the window, Lydia could see the Beaumont estate lit up like a small sun. Carriages were queuing, guests arriving in waves of silk and jewels, and barely contained curiosity. Adrian's expression shuddered, the brief moment of almost friendship disappearing behind the cool mask he wore in public. "Ready?" he asked. Lydia smoothed her dress, checked that her borrowed gloves were properly fastened, and took a breath. Ready? The door opened. Adrian stepped out first, then turned to offer his hand. When Lydia took it and emerged into the torchlight, she could feel dozens of eyes tracking the movement. Smile, Adrian murmured, so quiet only she could hear. You're madly in love with me, remember? How could I forget? But Lydia smiled anyway. The practiced expression she'd perfected over months of pretending everything was fine. They walked into the house together, and the whispers started immediately. Lady Beaumont greeted them with the kind of effusive warmth that barely concealed intense curiosity. Your Grace and Miss Hale, how wonderful to see you both. We're simply delighted you could attend. Everyone's been so eager to congratulate you. Thank you, Lady Beaumont, Adrian said with perfect courtesy. We're honored to be here. And Miss Hale, you must tell me everything. How did you and the Duke meet? Eleanor was terribly mysterious about the details. This was it, the first real test. Lydia felt Adrian's hand settle at the small of her back, a gesture of support that was also a warning. They hadn't coordinated their story, hadn't agreed on the details. She was improvising. We met through mutual friends, Lydia said, which was vague enough to be almost true if you considered Eleanor a mutual friend by the most generous definition. Though I'll admit, it took me some time to recognize the Duke's interest. Oh? Lady Beaumont leaned in, delighted. Do tell. His Grace is remarkably subtle when he wishes to be. Lydia glanced at Adrian, who was watching her with something that might have been approval or might have been warning. I mistook his attention for general politeness for quite some time. I'm not naturally effusive, Adrian added smoothly, picking up the thread. It took some persistence to convince Miss Hale I was serious in my regard. It was a good story, simple, believable, and fit with what people already knew about Adrian's reserved nature. Lady Beaumont practically glowed with the pleasure of being given inside information. How romantic! The strong, silent type finally finding the right woman. She gestured toward the drawing room. You must come in. Everyone will want to hear this. They entered a room full of exactly the kind of people Lydia had been avoiding for months. Wealthy, connected, influential. The type who dropped her the moment her family's money disappeared. Now they were all staring at her with renewed interest. Catherine Willoughby was there, of course, looking like she'd swallowed something sour. So was Susan Hampton, and at least a dozen other women who'd participated in Lydia's social exile. Miss Hale! Susan rushed over, all false warmth and barely concealed envy. We simply must hear all about this whirlwind romance. I had no idea you and the Duke were even acquainted. We kept things quiet, Lydia said, which was technically true. His Grace values his privacy. And yet he's chosen someone so unexpected. Catherine's smile was sharp. No offense, Lydia, dear, but we all thought the Duke would marry someone from his own circles. The insult was clear. You're not good enough for him, and we all know it. Lydia felt Adrian's hand tighten slightly at her back. When he spoke, his voice was ice. Miss Hale is from impeccable family, Catherine. The fact that you seem to have forgotten that says more about your own shortcomings than hers. The room went silent. Catherine's face flushed red. Adrian continued, still in that same cold, controlled tone. I chose Lydia because she's intelligent, composed, and entirely uninterested in the kind of petty social maneuvering that seems to occupy lesser minds. Perhaps that's why you find the match unexpected. It was brutal. It was also the most effective defense Lydia could have asked for. Catherine retreated with her dignity in tatters, and the other women suddenly became very interested in being polite. That was excessive, Lydia murmured, once they'd moved away from the group. That was necessary, Adrian corrected. They were testing you, testing us. Better to establish boundaries immediately. By humiliating Catherine in front of everyone? By making it clear that you're under my protection and insults toward you won't be tolerated. He guided her toward a quieter corner. Welcome to being engaged to a duke. People will either fawn over you or try to destroy you. There's very little middle ground. Which would you prefer they do? Neither. But if I have to choose, fawning is easier to manage than destruction. Adrian accepted 2 glasses of wine from a passing servant and handed her one. You handled Lady Beaumont well. The story about me being subtle, that was clever. It was also true. You are subtle. Am I? He looked genuinely surprised. You announced our engagement by letting your mother do it, then played along rather than causing a scene. That's either subtle or cowardly, and I don't think you're a coward." Adrian laughed, quiet and surprised. "I'm not sure whether that's a compliment or an insult. Can it be both? With you, I suspect everything is both." But he was smiling, that sharp expression that never quite reached his eyes, but suggested he was enjoying himself despite his better judgment. The evening continued. They navigated conversation after conversation, Lydia deflecting questions with practiced vagueness, while Adrian provided just enough detail to satisfy curiosity without giving away the complete fiction of their relationship. They danced once, a waltz that required Lydia to remember everything she'd learned years ago about proper form and distance. Adrian was a good dancer, technically perfect, controlled, and entirely too close for Lydia's comfort. "You're stiff," he murmured as they turned. "I'm concentrating." "On what?" "Not stepping on your feet, not saying the wrong thing, not giving anyone reason to doubt this engagement." Lydia met his gaze. "Pick one." "All of the above?" But his hand at her waist shifted slightly, steadying her. "Relax, you're doing fine." "Fine isn't good enough. Your mother's contract requires exceptional. My mother's contract requires a convincing performance, and you're providing that." Adrian's voice dropped lower. "Though I'll admit, I'm curious." "About what?" "About you, who you actually are beneath all this careful performance." He studied her face like he was trying to solve an equation. "You're very good at deflection, but you haven't actually told me anything real about yourself." "There's not much to tell. I doubt that. People who say there's not much to tell are usually the most interesting." The waltz ended and Adrian led her from the floor. "But we'll have time to explore that question. We have 3 months, after all." 3 months of this. Of pretending, performing, navigating social situations where one wrong word could destroy everything. Lydia felt the weight of it settling over her shoulders like a cloak. They left the Beaumont estate near midnight. The carriage ride back was quieter than the ride there, both of them exhausted by the constant performance. "You survived your first official appearance as my fiancée," Adrian said as they approached Lydia's house. "Barely. Barely is still surviving." He looked at her for a long moment. "You were better at this than I expected." "Low expectations?" "Realistic ones." This carriage stopped and Adrian opened the door himself before the driver could. "I'll send word about the next event. My mother has us scheduled for a garden party on Saturday." "Wonderful. I love garden parties." She didn't. She hated them, but sarcasm was becoming their shared language. Adrian smiled, that almost expression that suggested he knew exactly what she was thinking. "Liar. But you'll attend anyway because you're practical." "I'm many things. Practical is just the most useful one." She started to step down, but Adrian caught her hand. "Lydia." His voice was serious now, the humor gone. "If this becomes too much, if you need out, tell me. I won't hold you to the contract if it's actually damaging you." It was unexpected, kind even. And it made something complicated twist in Lydia's chest. "I'll manage," she said. "I'm sure you will. But the offer stands." He released her hand. "Good night, Lydia." "Good night, Adrian." She entered her house and stood in the dark hallway, still wearing her borrowed gloves, still feeling the ghost of Adrian's hand at her waist during the waltz. This was supposed to be simple, a transaction. 3 months of performance in exchange for her family's survival. But Adrian Vale was turning out to be considerably more complicated than his biography suggested. And Lydia, who'd agreed to this arrangement with clear eyes and no illusions, was starting to realize she might have miscalculated, because the biggest danger in a lie wasn't getting caught. It was starting to believe it yourself. Margaret found her the next morning, still sitting at the breakfast table with cold tea and a newspaper she wasn't reading. "You look terrible," Margaret said with sisterly bluntness. "Thank you. That's exactly what I needed to hear. The dinner didn't go well. The dinner went perfectly. That's the problem." Lydia set down the newspaper. "We were convincing, Margaret, too convincing. People believed us." "Isn't that the point?" "Yes. No, I don't know." Lydia rubbed her temples. "I just didn't expect Adrian to be... To be what? Tolerable." It sounded ridiculous when she said it out loud. "I expected him to resent me, to make this as difficult as possible. Instead, he's... We're almost friendly." Margaret sat down across from her. expression shrewd beyond her 18 years. And that's bad because? Because this is supposed to be a business arrangement. Emotions complicate things. Are you having emotions? No. Lydia said it too quickly. I'm starting to like him as a person, which makes lying to him harder. You're lying with him, not to him, Margaret pointed out. He knows this is fake. That doesn't make it less complicated. They sat in silence for a moment, and then Margaret reached across the table to take Lydia's hand. You're doing this for us, for Mother, for me, for Father. Don't forget that. Whatever else happens, you made the right choice. Had she? Lydia wanted to believe that, but sitting in the morning light with her sister's hand in hers, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd set something in motion that was going to be much harder to control than she'd anticipated. The next event came, and the next, and the one after that. 4 appearances in 1 week, each one requiring Lydia to smile and lie and pretend that this was real, while Adrian played his part beside her with increasing ease. They developed patterns, him deflecting political questions, her handling the social interrogation, both of them presenting a united front that people found simultaneously impressive and slightly intimidating. They were good together, that was the problem. At the opera, Adrian explained the plot in whispered asides that made her laugh despite herself. At the garden party, he rescued her from a conversation with Lord Pemberton that was quickly becoming unbearable. At Lady Morrison's dinner, he defended her taste in literature when someone suggested her reading choices were too serious for a woman. Each interaction made the lie easier and the truth more complicated, and then came the moment that changed everything. It was their 8th public appearance together, a charity auction at the Ashworth estate, the same place where Eleanor had first announced their engagement. Lydia had grown comfortable enough with the performance that she wasn't constantly calculating every word, every gesture. That was her first mistake. They were examining auction items, paintings, jewelry, antique books, when Adrian stopped in front of a small portrait of a woman reading. The style was unusual, almost modern, and the woman's expression was one of complete absorption. "This reminds me of you," Adrian said quietly. Lydia looked at the painting, then at him. "How so?" "The way you look when you think no one's watching, like you're somewhere else entirely." He was still studying the portrait, but his voice had changed, become more thoughtful. "You do that at these events. Retreat somewhere in your mind where all of this can't touch you." It was too observant, too real. Lydia felt something defensive rise in her chest. "That's not—" "I do it too," Adrian interrupted. "Have been for years. It's how you survive things you can't escape." He finally looked at her, and his expression was unguarded in a way she'd never seen. "But lately I've been doing it less. These events aren't quite as unbearable as they used to be." "Because of the engagement? People treating you differently?" "Because of you." The words hung in the air between them, and Lydia felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This wasn't part of the script. This wasn't performance. This was real, and it terrified her. "Adrian, I know," he said quickly. "I know what this is, what we agreed to, but I think we should acknowledge that it's become more complicated than either of us anticipated." Before Lydia could respond, before she could even process what was happening, Catherine Willoughby's voice cut through the moment like a knife. How touching! The Duke and his unexpected bride admiring art together. Lydia turned to find Catherine with 2 other women, all of them watching with expressions that made her stomach drop. "Though I did hear the most interesting rumor," Catherine continued, her smile sharp and vicious, "about the timeline of your engagement. Several people have noted that you were never seen together before Eleanor's announcement, almost as if the relationship appeared out of nowhere. It was a direct challenge, a trap." And Lydia could see the calculation in Catherine's eyes. She suspected something even if she didn't know exactly what. "Romance often does appear suddenly," Adrian said, his voice cooling. "That's rather the nature of it." "Is it? How convenient." Catherine's gaze shifted to Lydia. "And how fortunate for you, Miss Hale. To go from social obscurity to engagement with a duke in a single evening, one might almost call it miraculous." The implication was clear. The accusation barely veiled. This was it. The moment where everything could collapse, where one wrong word, one slip, could expose the entire lie and destroy not just the engagement, but both their reputations. Lydia felt Adrian tense beside her, preparing to defend her again. But something inside her snapped. She was tired of being defended, tired of being the damsel in this particular performance. She stepped forward, close enough to Catherine that the other woman had to either hold her ground or retreat. "You know what I find miraculous, Catherine?" Lydia's voice was quiet but carried perfectly. "That you've spent weeks questioning my engagement instead of examining why you're so threatened by it. Is it because Adrian chose someone who actually challenges him? Or is it because you realize that all your carefully cultivated connections and strategic social climbing still couldn't get you what I have?" Catherine's face went white, then red. "How dare—" "I dare because I'm tired of playing nice with people who mistake cruelty for wit and gossip for intelligence." Lydia smiled, and it wasn't her practiced society smile. It was something sharper, more honest. "You want to question my engagement? Go ahead, spread your rumors. See what happens when you publicly accuse a duke of dishonesty. I'm sure that will go wonderfully for you." The silence that followed was absolute. Catherine looked like she'd been slapped. The women with her had taken several steps back, distancing themselves from potential social suicide. And Adrian was staring at Lydia with an expression she couldn't quite read, but that made her pulse race. Catherine recovered first, her composure cracking at the edges. "You'll regret this." "I doubt it." Lydia turned her back, a deliberate dismissal. "Adrian, should we continue viewing the auction items? I've lost my taste for this particular conversation." They walked away together, and Lydia could feel the stares following them. She'd just made an enemy of one of London's most connected gossips, had possibly accelerated the very exposure she was trying to avoid. But she'd also stopped playing the victim. And that felt surprisingly good. They made it to a quieter corner before Adrian caught her arm, turning her to face him. "That was either brilliant or suicidal," he said. "I haven't decided which." "Probably both." Lydia was shaking slightly, adrenaline making her hands unsteady. "Did I just destroy everything?" "No." Adrian's grip on her arm gentled, became almost a caress. "You just made it much more interesting." "That's not reassuring." "It wasn't meant to be." He was studying her again, that intense focus that made her feel exposed. "Where did that come from? You've been so careful, so controlled, and then you just exploded." "I got tired of being careful." "I noticed." Adrian's voice dropped lower, and there was something in his expression that made Lydia's breath catch. It was extraordinary. They were standing too close. The auction continued around them, people moving past in a blur of color and conversation, but Lydia was acutely aware of Adrian's hand still on her arm, the heat of him, the way he was looking at her like he was seeing something new. "We should—" She didn't know how to finish that sentence. "We should," Adrian agreed, but he didn't move. Neither did she. This was dangerous. This was exactly what they'd both agreed wouldn't happen. No emotional entanglements, no complications. But standing in that moment, with Adrian's hand on her arm and something unspoken building between them, Lydia realized they'd already failed at that particular promise. The lie they were telling everyone else was starting to look a lot like the truth, and neither of them knew how to stop it. The carriage ride back to Lydia's house was silent in a way that felt different from before. Not the comfortable quiet of mutual exhaustion or the tense silence of strangers forced together. This was something else entirely, charged, dangerous, like the air before a thunderstorm. Adrian sat across from her, his expression unreadable in the dim lamplight filtering through the windows. Lydia kept her hands folded in her lap, acutely aware that they were still trembling slightly from the confrontation with Catherine. "That was reckless," Adrian said finally. "I know." "Catherine Willoughby has connections throughout London. She could make things very difficult for both of us." "I know that too." Lydia met his gaze. "But I'm tired of pretending to be small. If this whole arrangement is going to collapse anyway, I'd rather it happen because I chose to stand up for myself than because I cowered and let people like her tear me apart slowly." Adrian leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You think it's going to collapse? Don't you?" The question came out sharper than she intended. "We're halfway through this arrangement and we've already violated the most important rule." "Which rule is that?" "No emotional entanglements." Lydia's voice was quiet but steady. "You said it yourself at the auction. This has become more complicated than either of us anticipated." The silence that followed stretched until it became almost unbearable. Then Adrian did something unexpected. He laughed. It wasn't his usual controlled amusement. It was raw, almost bitter. "You're right," he said. I did say that. And I meant it. Which is possibly the most inconvenient realization I've had in years. Inconvenient, Lydia repeated. That's one word for it. What word would you use? Terrifying, impossible, completely at odds with everything she'd planned. But Lydia didn't say any of that. Instead, she looked out the window at the dark streets rolling past and tried to remember when exactly this had stopped being simple survival. Maybe it was during their third public appearance, when Adrian had made her laugh with a whispered observation about Lord Ashworth's terrible toupee. Maybe it was the night he'd spent 45 minutes defending her reading choices to a literary snob who clearly thought women shouldn't have opinions about philosophy. Maybe it was just the accumulated weight of all those small moments where he'd been kind when he didn't have to be, honest when it would have been easier to lie. The carriage stopped. Adrian helped her down, and this time his hand lingered in hers for just a second longer than necessary. "Lydia," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk, really talk. Not at a public event, not in a carriage between appearances. Just us." "When?" "Tomorrow. Come to my house, 1 o'clock. My mother will be occupied with her charity meetings." It was crossing a line they'd both been careful to maintain. They'd kept their interactions limited to public spaces, witnesses always nearby. Going to his house, alone, was something else entirely. "All right," Lydia said. She went inside and stood in the dark hallway, listening to the carriage pull away, wondering what she was walking into. Margaret was waiting in the drawing room, still dressed despite the late hour. "You look like someone who's just made a terrible decision," she observed. "I might have." "Does it involve the Duke?" "Everything involves the Duke right now." Lydia sank into a chair. "I'm going to his house tomorrow, alone." Margaret's eyebrows rose. "That's bold, also potentially scandalous if anyone finds out." "No one's going to find out. Eleanor will be gone, and Adrian said we need to talk." "About what?" "About how this arrangement is falling apart." Lydia closed her eyes. "Or how it's becoming something neither of us planned for. I'm not sure which is worse." She felt Margaret sit beside her, felt her sister's hand find hers in the darkness. "Do you love him?" Margaret asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke. Lydia wanted to say no, wanted to insist this was still just a transaction, a performance, a means to an end, but lying to Margaret felt impossible. "I don't know," she said instead. "I don't know what this is, but it's not what it was supposed to be. Maybe that's not a bad thing. It's a terrible thing. Margaret, this ends in 3 weeks. We signed a contract. At the end of 3 months, we part ways and I get the money to save our family. That's the deal. And if you don't want to part ways?" Lydia opened her eyes, staring at the ceiling. "Then I'm an even bigger fool than I thought." She didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Adrian's expression at the auction, heard his voice saying this has become more complicated, felt the weight of his hand on her arm, the way he'd looked at her like she was a puzzle he was desperate to solve. By the time dawn broke, Lydia had convinced herself 3 separate times to cancel the meeting, and 3 separate times she'd talked herself back into going. She arrived at Adrian's London residence at precisely 1 o'clock, dressed in a simple day dress that wouldn't attract attention. The butler who answered the door knew her by sight now, another small sign of how thoroughly this lie had infiltrated reality. "His Grace is expecting you in the library, Miss Hale." The library was on the 2nd floor, a massive room lined floor to ceiling with books that actually looked read rather than just decorative. Adrian was standing by the window when she entered, still dressed formally despite being in his own home. He turned when she closed the door, and the expression on his face made her chest tighten. "You came," he said. "You asked me to." "I wasn't sure you would." Adrian gestured to a pair of chairs near the fireplace. "Sit, please." Lydia sat, and the formality of it felt wrong after weeks of carefully choreographed public intimacy. Here, alone, they were suddenly strangers again. "I've been thinking," Adrian began, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration she'd never seen from him before. "That's not true. I haven't been thinking clearly about any of this since the night my mother announced our engagement." "Neither have I." "Good. At least we're equally confused." He sat down across from her, leaning forward. "Lydia, I need to ask you something. and I need you to be completely honest with me. All right? If my mother hadn't made this arrangement, if we'd met under normal circumstances, would you have been interested in me? The question caught her off guard. I don't know. We move in different worlds, Adrian. We wouldn't have met under normal circumstances. That's not what I asked. Lydia looked at him, really looked. At the intelligence in his eyes, the way he carried himself with absolute certainty, even when discussing his own uncertainty. The unexpected kindness he'd shown her, the way he'd defended her without being asked, the rare, genuine smiles that transformed his entire face. Yes, she said quietly. I think I would have been. Something in Adrian's expression shifted. Relief, maybe, or recognition. I keep telling myself this is just familiarity, he said, that we've spent enough time together that it's natural to develop some degree of connection. That once this arrangement ends, I'll forget about you and move on with my life. But you don't believe that. No, I don't. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back. I've been engaged before. Did you know that? Years ago, to a woman my mother approved of. We were perfectly suited on paper, same social standing, compatible interests, mutual respect. It lasted 6 months before I called it off. Lydia hadn't known. It wasn't in the biography Eleanor had given her. Why did you end it? Because I felt nothing, absolutely nothing. I could imagine spending 50 years with her and feeling exactly the same level of polite indifference I felt on our first meeting. Adrian stopped pacing, standing directly in front of her. With you, I feel everything. It's inconvenient and complicated and probably a disaster waiting to happen, but it's real. Lydia's heart was hammering so hard she could hear it. Adrian, let me finish. Please. He took a breath. In 3 weeks, this arrangement ends. You get the money to save your family, I get the political benefit of having been publicly engaged, and we both walk away. That was the deal. That's still the deal. I don't want that deal anymore. The words came out rushed, like he had to say them quickly before he lost his nerve. I want to turn this into a real engagement, a real marriage, not because of my mother's machinations or your family's debts or any kind of transaction, just because I can't imagine going back to my life without you in it. The world tilted. Lydia stood, needing the physical movement to process what she was hearing. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Adrian, we barely know each other. Everything we've built is based on lies. How can you possibly want to make that permanent? Because the lies led to something true. He moved closer, and Lydia had to resist the urge to step back. I know this is insane. I know it contradicts everything we agreed to. But I'm asking you to consider it anyway. Lydia's mind was racing. Marriage. Real marriage. Not the performance they'd been executing, but an actual life together. It would solve everything. The financial problems, Margaret's prospects, her mother's medical care. More than that, it would give her something she hadn't even realized she wanted until this moment. But it was also terrifying. I need to think, she said. Of course. Take whatever time you need. Adrian's voice was carefully controlled again, the vulnerability from moments ago locked away. I just needed you to know. Before this arrangement ends, before we run out of time. What if I say no? Then we honor the original contract. 3 weeks from now, we end the engagement amicably. You get your compensation, and we both move forward with our lives. He met her gaze. I won't pressure you, Lydia. This has to be your choice. She left his house in a daze, Adrian's words echoing in her head. A real marriage, a permanent arrangement, everything she'd been working toward, offered freely instead of bought with desperation, and she had no idea what to do with it. Thomas Blackwood found her 2 days later, sitting in the park and staring at nothing. You look like someone who's being haunted, he said, sitting beside her without invitation. That's accurate. Want to talk about it? Lydia looked at him. One of her few remaining real friends, someone who'd stuck by her through the worst of the social exile. If she couldn't be honest with Thomas, she couldn't be honest with anyone. Adrian wants to make this engagement real, she said. Thomas blinked. I'm sorry, what? So she told him. Everything. The original arrangement with Eleanor, the contract, the performances, and now Adrian's proposal to turn fiction into reality. When she finished, Thomas was staring at her with an expression somewhere between shock and awe. "Lydia Hale," he said slowly, "you've created the most elaborate scheme I've ever heard of, and now it's backfired in the most spectacular way possible. That's not helpful. It's also not wrong." Thomas leaned back on the bench. "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know. If I say yes, I get everything I need. The money, the security, even—" She trailed off. "Even what?" "Even him," Lydia admitted quietly. "Which is the most dangerous part of all this. Thomas, I think I might actually love him. And that's a problem because I don't know if it's real or if it's just—" She gestured helplessly. "We've spent weeks pretending to be in love. How do I know I'm not just believing my own lie?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me something. When you're with Adrian and no one else is watching, how do you feel?" Lydia thought about it. About the carriage rides between events, when they'd stopped performing. About the moments when Adrian would make an observation that made her laugh, or when he'd defend her without being asked. About the way her chest tightened when she saw him across a room. "Alive," she said. "I feel alive. That's real, Lydia. Whatever else this is, that part is real." Maybe Thomas was right. Maybe she was overthinking this, letting fear and caution override what she actually wanted. Or maybe she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. She was still wrestling with the decision 3 days later when Eleanor summoned her. The Dowager Duchess looked pleased when Lydia arrived, which was never a good sign. "My son tells me he's proposed to turn this arrangement into a genuine marriage," Eleanor said without preamble. "I assume you're here for my advice on the matter." "I'm here because you summoned me," Lydia corrected. "But yes, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts." "My thoughts are that you'd be a fool to refuse." Eleanor poured tea with practiced precision. "Adrian is offering you everything: title, security, social position. More than that, he's offering you a choice. That's remarkably generous of him." "Is it? Or is this just another version of the same manipulation you started?" Eleanor's smile was sharp. "You're learning. Yes, this serves my purposes beautifully. A real marriage is even better than a fake engagement for Adrian's political prospects. But that doesn't make his feelings any less genuine." "How can you be sure his feelings are genuine?" "Because I've known my son for 28 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Eleanor set down the teapot. "Adrian doesn't do anything by half measures. If he's proposing marriage, it's because he means it completely." Lydia absorbed that. "And what about my feelings? What if I don't love him?" "Do you?" The question was direct, unavoidable. And sitting in Eleanor's elegant drawing room, Lydia finally admitted the truth she'd been avoiding. "Yes, I think I do. But I don't trust it. I don't trust that it's not just survival instinct dressed up as emotion." "Love and survival aren't mutually exclusive," Eleanor said. "Sometimes the smartest decision is also the one that makes your heart race. Sometimes self-preservation looks like choosing the person who makes you feel safe enough to be reckless." "That's surprisingly romantic coming from you." "I'm not entirely heartless, Miss Hale. Just pragmatic." Eleanor's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "My marriage to Adrian's father was arranged. I didn't love him when we married, but I grew to love him deeply. The beginning of a relationship matters far less than what you build from it." It was the most personal thing Eleanor had ever shared with her, and it shifted something in Lydia's understanding. "If I say yes," Lydia said slowly, "the contract is void. You don't have to pay anything. Correct? Which means my family is still in debt. My mother still can't afford medical care. Margaret still has no prospects." Eleanor's smile widened. "Is that what you think? My dear girl, if you marry Adrian, you'll have access to the Ravenscroft fortune. You'll be able to solve all those problems yourself. You won't need my charity. You'll have your own resources." It was true. Marriage to Adrian meant financial security independent of Eleanor's manipulation. It meant freedom, not just survival. It also meant committing to a life with a man she'd known for less than 2 months. "I need to talk to him," Lydia said. "Then go. He's at the estate, avoiding me." Eleanor's tone was dry. "I believe he's sulking in the gardens." Lydia found Adrian exactly where Eleanor said he'd be, sitting on a stone bench surrounded by roses that were just beginning to bloom. He looked up when he heard her approach, and the hope in his expression made her chest ache. "Lydia," We need to talk, she said, really talk. No more careful politeness, no more strategic conversation, just honesty. Adrian stood, facing her directly. All right, what do you want to know? Why me? Truly, not the political answer, not the romantic speech. Why did you decide you wanted to marry me? He considered the question seriously, and Lydia appreciated that he didn't rush to answer. Because you're the first person in years who's treated me like a human being instead of a title, Adrian said finally. You argue with me. You call me out when I'm being pompous. You're not impressed by the dukedom or the estates or any of the trappings that usually make people defer to me. That's not entirely true. I was definitely impressed by the estates. Adrian laughed, surprised. See? That, you make me laugh. Do you know how rare that is? Most people are so busy trying to impress me or manipulate me that they forget to just be themselves. I'm not always myself around you, Lydia admitted. I've been performing too, Adrian, trying to be what you need me to be. I know, but the moments when you stop performing, those are the moments I can't stop thinking about. He moved closer. When you told Catherine off at the auction, when you fell asleep in the carriage after Lady Morrison's dinner and woke up embarrassed, when you defended the philosophical merits of determinism even though everyone else at the table thought you were wrong, those moments are real, and they're extraordinary. Lydia felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. What if we're making a mistake? What if this feeling is just adrenaline and proximity and the drama of the situation? Then we'll figure it out together. Adrian reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. Lydia, I'm not asking you to be certain. I'm asking you to take a chance, on us, on the possibility that something born from deception might become the most honest thing either of us has ever done. It was a good argument, maybe even a convincing one, but Lydia had spent too long being practical to ignore the risks. If I say yes, she said carefully, I need conditions. Name them. First, we wait. We don't announce any change to the arrangement until the original 3 months are complete. I need to be sure this isn't just temporary insanity. Adrian nodded. Agreed. What else? Second, if at any point during that time either of us realizes this is a mistake, we end it, cleanly. No hard feelings, no bitterness, just an honest acknowledgement that we tried and it didn't work. That's fair, though I don't think we'll need that clause. You don't know that. No, but I'm optimistic. His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. Is that everything? One more thing. Lydia met his gaze directly. No more lies. Not to each other. If we're going to do this, we do it with complete honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable, Adrian agreed. Starting now. Then I should tell you that I'm terrified. The admission came out rough, like it cost him something. I've spent years keeping people at a distance, staying in control of every situation, and you've completely destroyed that control. I have no idea what I'm doing, and it's both exhilarating and absolutely terrifying. Lydia felt something loosen in her chest. I'm terrified too. I'm terrified I'm choosing this because I'm desperate, not because I actually want it. I'm terrified that you'll wake up one day and realize you made a terrible mistake. I'm terrified that I'm not enough, that without the performance, you'll see who I actually am and be disappointed. Who you actually are is brilliant and fierce and more resilient than anyone I've ever met, Adrian said. That's not going to change when we stop performing. You can't know that. No, but I'm willing to find out. He pulled her closer, and Lydia let herself lean into the warmth of him. Is that a yes? It's a conditional yes. A we'll see how this goes yes. A yes, but I reserve the right to change my mind yes. Adrian smiled, that genuine expression that transformed his entire face. I'll take it. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the careful, performative kisses they'd exchanged at public events for appearances. This was real, messy and uncertain, and absolutely devastating in its honesty. When they finally broke apart, Lydia was breathless, and her carefully pinned hair was coming loose, and she didn't care even a little bit. We should probably discuss logistics, she managed. Logistics can wait. Adrian's voice was rough. Right now, I just want to enjoy the fact that you didn't immediately reject me. The day is young. I might still change my mind. You won't. Confident. Hopeful, he corrected. Then, more seriously, Lydia, I know this is complicated. I know we're taking a massive risk, but I think you're worth that risk. Even if I come with debt and social scandal and a family that's barely hanging on, especially then, you've survived things that would have destroyed most people. That kind of strength is rare. He brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. Besides, I find that I quite like complicated women who challenge me. Makes life more interesting. They stayed in the garden until the light began to fade, talking about everything and nothing. About Adrian's political work and Lydia's dreams of travel. About Margaret and her education. About Eleanor's matchmaking and how spectacularly it had backfired. About all the small, ordinary details that built a life together. It was the first real conversation they'd had without an audience, without an agenda. And it felt like finally stepping off a stage after a long performance. But the performance wasn't over. Not yet. 3 days later, Catherine Willoughby made her move. Lydia was having tea with Margaret when their housekeeper brought in the afternoon post. Among the usual correspondence was a thick envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in elegant script. I know your engagement is a fraud. I have proof. Meet me at the Grosvenor Hotel tomorrow at 2 o'clock if you'd like to prevent this information from becoming public. Come alone. Lydia's hands went numb. What is it? Margaret asked. Trouble. Lydia read the note again, her mind racing. Catherine knows. Or she thinks she knows. Either way, she's threatening to expose us. That's blackmail. That's Catherine. Lydia stood pacing the length of the drawing room. I need to tell Adrian. She sent a message immediately. Adrian arrived within the hour, his expression dark when she showed him the note. How could she possibly know? Lydia asked. We've been so careful. Catherine is many things, but she's not stupid. She's been suspicious from the beginning, and she has resources. Adrian crumpled the note in his fist. The question is what she actually knows versus what she's guessing. Does it matter? If she makes enough noise, asks enough questions, someone will start digging, and when they dig, they'll find the truth. Not necessarily. The contract is confidential. My mother would never admit to the arrangement. It would make her look manipulative. The only people who know the truth are you, me, and her. And whoever Catherine has been talking to. Servants, friends, anyone who might have noticed something off about our engagement. Lydia sank into a chair. This is a disaster. This is manageable. But Adrian's voice was tight with tension. You're not going to that meeting alone. She said, I don't care what she said. You're not walking into that hotel room without backup. Adrian pulled out his pocket watch, checking the time. I'll be there. She won't see me, but I'll be close enough to intervene if necessary. And if she has actual proof, if she's not just fishing, then we deal with it. Adrian knelt in front of her chair, taking her hands. Lydia, listen to me. Whatever Catherine has, whatever she thinks she knows, we're going to handle it together. You're not alone in this anymore. The next day arrived too quickly. Lydia dressed carefully. Nothing too formal, nothing that would draw attention. She left Margaret at home with strict instructions not to tell their parents anything that might worry them. The Grosvenor Hotel was busy with afternoon tea service. Lydia made her way to the second floor, where Catherine had specified a private room. Her heart was hammering so hard she could barely breathe. Catherine was already there, sitting in an armchair with the kind of satisfied expression that made Lydia's stomach drop. Lydia, how good of you to come. Let's skip the pleasantries. What do you want? What? Catherine smiled, setting down her teacup with deliberate care. Right to business. I appreciate that. Very well. I want you to end your engagement to the Duke of Ravenscroft, publicly. Admit that it was a mistake, that you're not suited, that you've realized you were only interested in his title and fortune. That's insane. Why would I do that? Because if you don't, I'll make sure all of London knows that your engagement is a complete fabrication arranged by Eleanor Vale to manipulate her son. Catherine pulled a folder from the table beside her. I have evidence. Correspondence between you and Eleanor. Records of payments made to settle your family's debts immediately following the engagement announcement. Testimony from servants who've never seen you and Adrian exchange a single personal word outside of public events. Lydia's mouth went dry. You've been investigating me. I've been curious. There's a difference. Catherine opened the folder, displaying what looked like official documents. The question is, how much is your reputation worth to you? End the engagement, and this all stays private. Refuse, and I'll make sure every newspaper in London prints the truth. This is blackmail. This is business. Surely you understand business, given how thoroughly you've monetized your association with the Duke. Lydia's mind was racing. She could end the engagement, protect herself from scandal, walk away with at least some dignity intact. But she'd lose Adrian, lose the future they'd been cautiously building, lose everything they'd agreed to just days ago in the garden. Or she could refuse Catherine's demands and risk exposure, scandal, complete social destruction. Both options were terrible. I need time to think, Lydia said. You have until tomorrow evening, 6 o'clock. After that, my information goes to the newspapers. Catherine stood, smoothing her skirts. Choose wisely, Lydia. Your entire future depends on it. Lydia left the hotel in a daze. She found Adrian waiting in his carriage 2 streets away, exactly as he'd promised. What did she say? He asked the moment she climbed inside. She wants me to end the engagement, publicly, humiliatingly, or she'll expose everything. Lydia's voice was shaking. Adrian, she has evidence, real evidence, correspondence, payment records, servant testimony. Let me see. She didn't give me copies, but she showed me enough that I know she's not bluffing. Adrian's jaw tightened. This is my mother's fault. She didn't cover her tracks well enough. It doesn't matter whose fault it is. What matters is that Catherine can destroy both of us, and we have less than 24 hours to stop her. They sat in tense silence while the carriage moved through London streets. Lydia's mind was spinning through scenarios, each one worse than the last. Finally, Adrian spoke. There's one way to neutralize Catherine's leverage completely. What? We make the engagement real, right now. We get married immediately, before she can publish anything. Once we're actually married, her evidence becomes irrelevant. Yes, the engagement started as an arrangement, but marriages that begin practically aren't scandalous. They're common. We simply say we made a sensible match that developed into genuine affection. Lydia stared at him. You want to get married, tomorrow. Today, if possible. Special license, small ceremony, just us and the necessary witnesses. Adrian's expression was intense. It's the only way to protect both of us. Once we're legally married, Catherine's story loses its power. We're not a fake engagement anymore. We're a real marriage that started unconventionally. That's insane. That's survival. He caught her hands. Lydia, I know this isn't how either of us imagined this happening. I know it's rushed and desperate and far from ideal. But it's also our only option if we want to stay together. And if I say no, if I choose to end the engagement like Catherine wants, then we both walk away and I'll do everything I can to minimize the damage to your reputation. Adrian's voice was steady. But I'm asking you not to choose that. I'm asking you to choose us, choose the future we talked about in the garden, choose the risk. Lydia's thoughts were chaos. Marriage, real marriage. Not in 3 weeks after careful consideration, but right now, under duress, with Catherine's threat hanging over them. It was the opposite of everything she'd wanted. The opposite of the careful, practical approach she'd promised herself. But it was also the only way forward. If we do this, she said slowly, there's no going back. No trial period, no conditional yes. This is permanent. I know. And we'll be doing it for the wrong reasons. Not because we're ready, but because we're cornered. We're doing it because Catherine forced our hand, but that doesn't make the marriage any less real. Adrian's grip on her hands tightened. Lydia, I love you. I've been trying not to say it because I didn't want to pressure you, but if we're making this decision right now, you deserve to know. I love you, not the performance, not the idea of you. You, the real, complicated, brilliant woman who's been driving me insane for the past 2 months. The words hit her like a physical force. Adrian, you don't have to say it back. You don't have to feel the same way. But I need you to know that I'm not proposing this marriage just to escape scandal. I'm proposing it because I want to spend my life with you, and I'd rather start that life under difficult circumstances than not start it at all. Lydia felt tears burning her eyes. This was everything she'd been afraid of, the vulnerability, the risk, the complete loss of control. It was also everything she wanted. I love you too, she whispered, and I'm terrified. So am I. Adrian pulled her close, and she let herself collapse against him. So we'll be terrified together. They sat holding each other while the carriage rattled through London streets, and Lydia felt the last of her careful defenses crumble. This wasn't the safe, strategic choice. This wasn't survival disguised as romance. This was real. Messy and desperate and absolutely genuine. "All right," she said against his shoulder. "Let's do it. Let's get married." Adrian pulled back just enough to see her face. "You're sure?" "No, but I'm choosing it anyway." Lydia managed a shaky laugh. "That's probably a terrible sign." "Or the best one possible." He kissed her forehead. "I'll arrange everything. We can be married by this evening if we move quickly." "What about your mother?" "She'll be furious we didn't give her time to plan an elaborate ceremony. She'll also be delighted that her scheme worked, even if not exactly as she intended." Adrian's smile was wry. "Let her find out after the fact. This is our decision, not hers." The next few hours passed in a blur. Adrian procured a special license with terrifying efficiency. They gathered the minimal required witnesses: Thomas, who looked simultaneously shocked and impressed, and Eleanor's housekeeper, who agreed to participate with the kind of discretion that suggested she'd seen stranger things in the Vale household. By 6 o'clock that evening, Lydia was standing in a small chapel wearing the same dress she'd worn to the Grosvenor Hotel, saying vows she'd never imagined saying under these circumstances. Adrian's hand was steady in hers. His voice didn't waver when he promised to love and honor her. And when the minister pronounced them married, the kiss they shared was nothing like their previous performances. This was real. Catastrophically, wonderfully, terrifyingly real. They emerged from the chapel as the sun was setting, and Lydia looked at the ring now on her finger, a simple band that Adrian had somehow produced on impossibly short notice. "We're married," she said, and it still didn't feel entirely real. "We are." Adrian helped her into the carriage. "Now we just have to tell everyone else. And deal with Catherine. Catherine's threat is neutralized. She can publish whatever she wants. We'll simply confirm that our engagement began as a practical arrangement and developed into genuine affection, not particularly scandalous by society's standards." He was right. Marriage changed everything. Catherine's leverage had evaporated the moment Lydia became the Duchess of Ravenscroft. But sitting in the carriage beside her new husband, Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just traded one kind of trap for another. They'd escaped Catherine's blackmail by rushing into a marriage neither of them was prepared for. They'd turned a lie into truth through sheer desperation, and now they had to figure out how to build a real life from that foundation. The carriage pulled up to Adrian's townhouse. Her townhouse now, Lydia realized with a jolt. Her home, her life, her husband. Adrian helped her down, and they stood on the steps together, neither of them quite ready to go inside and face what they'd just done. "Regrets?" Adrian asked quietly. Lydia thought about it, about the chaos of the past few hours, the desperate decision, the vows spoken under pressure, about Catherine's threat and Eleanor's manipulation and all the lies that had led them here, about Adrian's hand in hers and the way he'd said "I love you" like it was the simplest truth in the world. "Ask me again in a year," she said. They went inside together, and Lydia closed the door on the street, on Catherine's threats, on the woman she'd been just hours ago. She was a duchess now, a wife, a woman who'd just made the most reckless decision of her life. And as Adrian led her deeper into the house that was now theirs, Lydia wondered if reckless might turn out to be exactly what she needed. The house was quiet, too quiet. Lydia stood in the entrance hall of what was now her home, staring at the marble floors and expensive paintings like they belonged to someone else's life, which, until approximately 3 hours ago, they had. Adrian was speaking to his butler, giving instructions about rooms, about dinner, about 100 small details that suddenly mattered because Lydia lived here now. She caught fragments of the conversation but couldn't quite make herself focus on the words. "Your Grace." It took Lydia a moment to realize the butler was addressing her. "Your Grace. Duchess of Ravenscroft. Her title now." "I'm sorry, what?" "I asked if you'd like me to show you to your rooms," the butler repeated patiently. "His Grace mentioned you might want to freshen up before dinner." Her rooms, plural, because duchesses apparently required multiple rooms. "Yes, thank you." She followed him up the grand staircase, acutely aware of Adrian watching her go. The rooms turned out to be a suite, a bedroom, a sitting room, a dressing room, all connected and all larger than the entire ground floor of her family's house. The furniture was elegant but impersonal, chosen by someone with excellent taste and no particular sentiment. The Dowager Duchess's belongings have been moved to the estate, the butler explained. These rooms have been unused for several years. If you'd like anything changed, you need only ask. Lydia nodded, unable to form words. The butler left, and she was alone in rooms that were supposed to be hers, but felt like a museum. She sank onto the edge of the bed, an enormous four-poster thing that could sleep 6 people comfortably, and finally let herself feel the full weight of what she'd just done, married. She was married to Adrian Vale, not engaged, not performing, not pretending, actually, legally, irrevocably married. A knock at the door made her jump. "It's me." Adrian's voice came through the wood. "May I come in?" "It's your house." "It's your room." But he opened the door anyway, stepping inside with the kind of careful uncertainty she'd never seen from him before. "Are you all right?" "I don't know." Lydia looked at her hands, at the ring catching the lamplight. "This doesn't feel real." "No, it doesn't." Adrian sat beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "I keep expecting to wake up and discover this was some elaborate fever dream. Would that be better or worse?" "I'm not sure." He was quiet for a moment. "Lydia, I know this isn't what you wanted. Not like this, not this fast. If you need time, if you need space—" "What I need," Lydia interrupted, "is to understand what happens next. We got married to neutralize Catherine's threat. Fine, that worked. But now what? We can't just— What? Pretend this is normal?" "Why not?" Adrian's voice was steady. "We've been pretending for 2 months. We're excellent at it." "That's not the same. This is permanent." "Yes, it is." He turned to face her fully, which means we have 2 choices. We can treat this like a disaster we're both trapped in, or we can treat it like an opportunity to build something real without the pressure of performance. Lydia wanted to believe that, wanted to think they could just transition from fake engagement to real marriage without consequence. But years of being practical, of understanding that nothing came without cost, made her skeptical. "You're an optimist," she said. "I prefer strategically hopeful." Adrian's mouth quirked. "We're intelligent people, Lydia. We can figure this out." "Can we? Because I don't have the first idea how to be a duchess, or a wife, or any of this." "Neither do I. Be a duke, I mean. Or a husband." He caught her hand, threading their fingers together. "So we'll learn together, make mistakes together, figure it out as we go." It should have been terrifying. It was terrifying. But there was also something oddly comforting about Adrian's complete lack of pretense. He wasn't promising her perfection or certainty, just partnership. "I should probably tell my family," Lydia said. "They're going to be— I don't even know what they're going to be." Shocked, probably, possibly horrified at the haste. Adrian squeezed her hand. "Do you want me there when you tell them?" "Would you?" "Of course. You're my wife. We're in this together now." Wife. The word still felt foreign, but hearing Adrian say it with such certainty made it feel slightly more real. They went to Lydia's family home the next morning. The carriage ride was tense with anticipation, Lydia rehearsing different ways to explain what she'd done and discarding each one as insufficient. Margaret answered the door herself, took one look at Lydia's face, and said, "What did you do?" "Is everyone home?" "Mother's in the drawing room, father's in his study." "Lydia, what's wrong? You look—" Margaret's gaze dropped to Lydia's left hand, to the ring she'd forgotten to hide, and her eyes went wide. "Oh no, you didn't. We need to talk, all of us." 5 minutes later, the entire Hale family was assembled in the drawing room, and Lydia was standing in front of them with Adrian at her side, trying to find words that would make this make sense. "I got married yesterday," she said finally. "To Adrian. We're married." The silence was deafening. Her mother spoke first, her voice faint. "Yesterday? But the engagement was supposed to last 3 months. You weren't supposed to marry until— Plans changed." Lydia took a breath. "There were complications. We had to accelerate the timeline." "Complications?" Her father stood, and his expression was harder than Lydia had seen it in months. "What kind of complications require a secret marriage?" "The kind that involved blackmail and social destruction if we didn't act immediately," Adrian said quietly. "I understand this is shocking, but I promise you I have every intention of honoring my commitment to your daughter." "Your commitment?" Edward's laugh was bitter. Your Grace, forgive me, but I'm having trouble believing this marriage is anything more than another manipulation. First your mother's scheme, now this rushed wedding. Father, please, Lydia stepped forward. I know this looks terrible. I know it's not what any of us planned, but I made this choice. Me. Not Eleanor, not Adrian. I chose this because it was the only way to protect both of us from someone who wanted to destroy us. Who? Margaret asked. Who was blackmailing you? Catherine Willoughby. She'd figured out that our engagement started as an arrangement, and she had evidence, real evidence. She threatened to expose everything unless I publicly humiliated myself and Adrian. Lydia met her father's gaze. So we took away her leverage. We got married. Now her evidence is irrelevant. Her mother looked close to fainting. Margaret was staring at Lydia like she'd grown a second head, but her father's expression was shifting from anger to something more complicated. You chose this, he repeated, knowing it was permanent, knowing you were tying yourself to a man you barely know. I know him better than you think. Lydia felt Adrian's hand settle at her back, a gesture of support. And yes, it's rushed. Yes, it's complicated, but it's also real. I wouldn't have done this just to escape scandal. I did it because I want to be married to him. Do you love him? Margaret's question was direct, unavoidable. Lydia looked at Adrian, at the careful hope in his expression, and made a choice to be honest. Yes, I do. The admission hung in the air. Adrian's hand tightened at her back, and when she glanced at him, the emotion in his face made her chest ache. I love her too, he said, his voice rough. I know that doesn't excuse the haste or the secrecy, but I need you all to know that I'm not taking your daughter for granted. She's the most extraordinary person I've ever met, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving I deserve her. Lydia had heard Adrian give speeches in Parliament, had watched him charm rooms full of skeptical politicians. But this was different. This was raw and unpolished, and completely sincere. Her mother started crying. Margaret reached for Lydia's hand, and her father sank back into his chair, looking exhausted. Well, Edward said finally, I suppose we can't exactly undo a marriage. No, you can't. Lydia sat beside him. But I promise you, this isn't going to be like the arrangement with Eleanor. This is real. And it's going to be all right. You can't know that. No, but I'm choosing to believe it anyway. They stayed for another hour, answering questions and accepting tentative congratulations. Margaret pulled Lydia aside before they left, her expression serious. Are you sure about this? She asked quietly. Really sure? I'm sure that I made the right choice in the moment, Lydia said. Whether it turns out to be the right choice long term, I guess we'll find out. That's not very reassuring. No, but it's honest. Lydia hugged her sister. Take care of mother and father. I'll visit soon. Back at the townhouse, reality started to settle in. Lydia was a duchess now, which meant responsibilities, expectations, a whole social structure she needed to navigate. Adrian spent the afternoon explaining his various estates, his parliamentary work, the network of tenants and servants and business managers who all reported to him. It was overwhelming. You don't have to learn everything immediately, Adrian said, catching her expression. We can take this slowly. Can we? Because it feels like we're already moving at lightning speed. Then we slow down, starting now. He gestured to the library door. Would you like to have dinner? Just us? No formality? No performance? Just dinner. It was the first normal thing anyone had suggested in days. Lydia nodded, grateful. Dinner was quiet, almost comfortable. They talked about small things, books, politics, Adrian's ridiculous argument with another member of Parliament over agricultural subsidies. Nothing heavy, nothing that required them to acknowledge the massive shift in their relationship. But when the meal ended and they were both lingering over wine, neither of them was really drinking. The unspoken question filled the room. I had the staff prepare the Duchess's suite for you, Adrian said carefully. But if you'd prefer different arrangements, what would normal be? Lydia interrupted. If we'd gotten married under normal circumstances, what would happen now? Adrian's expression was unreadable. That would depend on the couple. Some choose to share rooms immediately. Others maintain separate spaces and come together when they choose. What do you want? I want you to be comfortable. I want you to have space to adjust without feeling pressured. He set down his wine glass. Lydia, I meant what I said yesterday. I love you.
But that doesn't mean I expect anything from you that you're not ready to give. It was the right thing to say. Kind, respectful, perfectly considerate. And it made Lydia realize how tired she was of being careful.
I don't want separate rooms, she said. I don't want to spend our wedding night pretending this is just a business arrangement. I want... She trailed off, uncertain how to finish. Adrian stood, moving around the table until he was close enough to touch. What do you want? I want to stop being practical for one night. I want to choose something just because I want it, not because it's strategic or safe or sensible. She looked up at him. I want you. The kiss that followed was nothing like the desperate press of lips in the chapel or the careful performances at public events. This was slow, deliberate, a question and an answer all at once. Adrian's hands were gentle at her waist, and Lydia let herself melt into him, let herself stop calculating consequences and just feel. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. Are you sure? He asked. No, but I'm choosing it anyway. He laughed, soft and surprised. That seems to be your approach to everything lately. It's working so far. He took her hand, leading her from the dining room, up the grand staircase, past the Duchess's suite to his own rooms. And Lydia, who'd spent so long being the woman no one chose, let herself be chosen. Let herself choose back. The next morning brought Eleanor. Lydia woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows, and Adrian's arm heavy across her waist. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why everything felt different. Then memory returned in a rush, the wedding, the vows, the night that had followed. She was married. Actually, thoroughly, irrevocably married. Adrian stirred beside her, his eyes opening. Morning. Morning. Lydia's voice was rough. We should probably... A sharp knock at the door interrupted her. Adrian's butler's voice came through, apologetic but firm. Your Grace, the Dowager Duchess has arrived and is requesting an immediate audience. Adrian groaned. Of course she is. He sat up, running a hand through his hair. Stay here. I'll handle her. Absolutely not. She's going to find out eventually. Lydia was already reaching for her clothes from the night before. Besides, I'd rather face her now than spend the day dreading it. They dressed quickly, and Lydia tried not to think about how domestic it felt, how normal, like they'd been doing this for years instead of hours. Eleanor was waiting in the drawing room, looking immaculate despite the early hour. Her expression when they entered was unreadable. Mother, Adrian said, this is unexpected. Is it? You got married yesterday without informing me, and you thought I wouldn't notice? Eleanor's gaze traveled between them, sharp and assessing. Sit, both of you. We need to talk. They sat. Lydia braced herself for fury, for recriminations, for Eleanor to tear into them for ruining her carefully laid plans. Instead, Eleanor smiled. Well played, she said. Both of you. I'll admit I didn't see this coming. Adrian blinked. You're not angry? Angry? Why would I be angry? You've done exactly what I wanted, secured a proper marriage that benefits both families. The fact that you did it on your own timeline rather than mine is actually rather impressive. Eleanor's smile widened. Though I would have appreciated an invitation to the ceremony. It was somewhat rushed, Lydia said carefully. Catherine Willoughby, I assume? At their expressions, Eleanor laughed. Please, I have spies everywhere. I knew about Catherine's investigation within days of its starting. I also knew she'd found some inconvenient evidence. And you didn't think to warn us? Adrian's voice was tight with barely controlled frustration. I thought you were intelligent enough to handle it yourselves. And you were. Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirts. Now, we need to manage the public narrative. The marriage will be announced in tomorrow's papers. I've already drafted the notice, emphasizing the love match, the whirlwind romance, all very romantic and not at all suspicious. You drafted it before we even told you? Lydia asked. I drafted it 3 days ago when it became clear where things were heading. Eleanor's expression was almost fond. You're both predictable in the best possible way. Now there's a reception at the Pemberton estate tomorrow night. You'll attend as a married couple. Make an appearance, accept congratulations, show everyone that this marriage is real and happy. We just got married yesterday, Adrian protested. Can't we have a few days to... To what? Hide? The longer you wait to appear in public, the more people will speculate about why. Eleanor moved toward the door. Tomorrow night, wear something appropriate, both of you. And Lydia, do try to look radiantly happy. You're a new bride, after all. She swept out, leaving them in stunned silence. Your mother is terrifying, Lydia said finally. Yes, but she's also right. Adrian stood, offering his hand. We need to take control of the narrative before Catherine does. One public appearance, united front, and her leverage disappears completely. The reception the next night was even more elaborate than Lydia had anticipated. The Pemberton estate was lit up like a palace, and it seemed like every important person in London had received an invitation. Lydia wore a gown that had been delivered that afternoon, courtesy of Eleanor, who'd somehow known her exact measurements. It was beautiful, elegant, and made her look every inch the Duchess she now was. Adrian was waiting at the bottom of the stairs when she descended, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. You're staring, she said. I'm admiring my wife. I'm allowed. He offered his arm. Ready? No, but let's do it anyway. The moment they entered the ballroom, conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward them, and Lydia felt the weight of scrutiny like a physical thing. Then someone started clapping. Others joined in. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding their entrance. Well, Adrian murmured, that's unexpected. They were immediately surrounded by well-wishers. Lady Pemberton gushed about how romantic the whole thing was. Lord Ashworth made a toast to young love. Even people who'd snubbed Lydia for months were suddenly eager to congratulate her. It was surreal, overwhelming, and it would have been unbearable if Adrian hadn't stayed at her side, his hand steady at her back, intercepting the worst of the attention. Then Catherine appeared. She looked perfect as always, but there was something brittle in her expression, something desperate. Your Grace, she said to Lydia, the title sounding almost mocking. How wonderful to see you. I heard the most interesting news yesterday. Did you? Lydia kept her voice pleasant. What news was that? About your sudden marriage. So unexpected. One might even say suspiciously rushed. Catherine's smile was sharp, almost as if you were trying to hide something. The nearby conversations quieted. People were listening, waiting to see how Lydia would respond. This was it. The moment Catherine had been waiting for. A public confrontation where she could plant doubts, spread suspicions, undermine everything. But Lydia had learned something over the past 2 months. She'd learned that the best defense wasn't denial. It was honesty. You're absolutely right, she said clearly. Our marriage was rushed, because when you know you found the right person, waiting seems pointless. Catherine blinked, thrown. But surely what? You think there's some scandal here? Lydia smiled. Catherine, I know you've been investigating my engagement. I know you have evidence that it started as a practical arrangement between Eleanor and myself. And I'm telling you right now, yes, that's true. Adrian's mother approached me with a proposition, an engagement in exchange for solving my family's financial difficulties. The room had gone completely silent. Adrian's hand tightened at her back, but he didn't interrupt. I accepted, Lydia continued, because I was desperate and practical and willing to do whatever it took to save my family. And then something unexpected happened. I fell in love with him. Really, genuinely in love. So yes, this marriage was rushed. Yes, it started unconventionally, but it's also the most real thing I've ever done. Catherine looked like she'd been slapped. You're admitting... I'm admitting that I married for practical reasons that became emotional ones, which is exactly what half the marriages in this room are. Lydia's gaze swept the crowd. How many of you married for love versus status, for affection versus alliance? The only difference between my marriage and yours is that I'm being honest about it. The silence stretched. Then Lady Pemberton laughed. Well said, Your Grace. Refreshingly honest, actually. She turned to the crowd. I married Lord Pemberton because my father insisted and his family needed money. We've been perfectly content for 30 years. Love grows, doesn't it? Sometimes it just needs a practical foundation. Other voices joined in, sharing stories of arranged marriages and practical unions that had become genuine partnerships. The tide was turning, and Catherine was losing her audience. This is absurd, Catherine said, her voice rising. You can't just admit to what? To being strategic? To making a smart match that benefited both families? Adrian spoke for the first time, his voice cold and clear. Catherine,
You've been spreading rumors for weeks trying to damage my wife's reputation. But here's the truth. Society doesn't care how marriages begin. They care how they endure. And I intend to make sure this one endures spectacularly.
He turned to Lydia, and the look in his eyes was so intense it made her dizzy. Then he kissed her, right there in the middle of the Pemberton ballroom, in front of 300 witnesses. It wasn't a performance kiss. It was real, deep and passionate, and completely inappropriate for a public setting. When they finally broke apart, the room erupted in applause. Catherine stood frozen, her carefully constructed attack crumbling around her. She'd wanted to expose a scandal. Instead, she'd given Lydia the opportunity to reframe the entire narrative. "If you'll excuse us," Lydia said pleasantly, "my husband and I should make the rounds. So many people to thank for their well wishes." They left Catherine standing alone, her defeat absolute and public. The rest of the evening was a blur of congratulations and curious questions. But Lydia noticed something shifting. People weren't looking at her with pity anymore. They were looking at her with respect, maybe even admiration. She'd done something they'd all been too afraid or too proud to do. She'd admitted the truth and claimed it as strength. Later, in the carriage ride home, Adrian was quiet. "That was extraordinary," he said finally. "That was terrifying. You completely dismantled Catherine's attack. You took control of the narrative and made it impossible for her to use her evidence against us." He turned to face her. "Lydia, do you understand what you just did? You didn't just protect us. You've changed how society sees you. You're not the fallen debutante anymore. You're the woman who married a duke through strategy and turned it into love." "Is that what I am?" "That's what they think you are. And perception is power." Adrian caught her hand. "You're not invisible anymore. You're formidable." Formidable. Lydia tested the word, found she liked it. "What about Catherine?" she asked. "Catherine's finished?" She tried to expose a scandal and instead made herself look petty and vindictive. "She'll recover eventually, but not for a while." Adrian's smile was sharp. "You won, Lydia, completely." The next few days proved him right. Invitations arrived by the dozen, luncheons, dinners, garden parties, all wanting the presence of the new Duchess of Ravenscroft. The same people who'd avoided her for months were suddenly eager for her attention. Lydia found it both gratifying and exhausting. But more than the social victories, more than the invitations and the newfound respect, what surprised her most was how natural marriage to Adrian had become. They fell into rhythms without discussing them. Breakfast together, Adrian working in his study while Lydia read in the library, dinners where they talked about everything and nothing. It felt like they'd been doing this for years. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the wedding, Lydia was in the library when Adrian found her. "I need to show you something," he said. He led her to his study where papers were spread across his desk, financial documents, estate records, investment portfolios. "I've been reviewing our finances," Adrian said, "consolidating accounts, organizing everything, and I realized we need to discuss something." Lydia's stomach dropped. "What?" "Your family's debts. My mother's original agreement was that she'd pay them off in exchange for the fake engagement, but now that we're married, that agreement is void." "I know." Lydia had been trying not to think about it. "We'll figure something out. I already paid them," Adrian interrupted. "All of them. Every creditor your father owes. I also established a medical fund for your mother and arranged for Margaret's season next year with full ducal sponsorship." Lydia stared at him. "You... what?" "I should have told you before I did it, but I wanted to surprise you." Adrian moved closer. "Lydia, you're my wife. Your family is my family now. Their problems are our problems, and we have more than enough resources to solve them." "That's not why I married you." "I know. That's exactly why I did it." He caught her hands. "You chose me when you didn't have to. You could have ended the engagement like Catherine wanted, protected yourself, walked away, but you chose us instead. This is me choosing your family, choosing to be the partner you deserve." Lydia felt tears burning her eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll come with me to visit them tomorrow. I'd like to tell them in person." Adrian's expression was soft. "And maybe you could stop looking quite so shocked. I'm your husband. Taking care of your family is literally my responsibility now." They went to the Hale house the next day. Lydia watched Adrian explain the debt relief to her father, saw Edward's face crumble with relief and gratitude, watched him discuss medical options with her mother, who actually looked hopeful for the first time in months. listened as he promised Margaret a season that would make her the most sought-after debutante in London. Her family's burdens, the weight Lydia had been carrying for 18 months, lifted. On the carriage ride home, she couldn't stop touching Adrian's hand, unable to quite believe this was real. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You don't need to thank me. This is what marriage is supposed to be." Adrian pulled her close. Partnership, support, choosing each other every day. "Is that what we're doing?" "I think so. Are you?" Lydia thought about it, about the rushed wedding and the public declaration and the way she'd stopped calculating odds when she looked at him, about how terrifying and wonderful it felt to trust someone completely. "Yes," she said. "I'm choosing you, every day." That night they attended yet another function, this time a small dinner party at Lord Morrison's estate. Lydia wore emerald silk and diamonds that had belonged to Adrian's grandmother, and when they entered the room together, conversations didn't stop anymore. People smiled, nodded, made space for them at the table. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft. A team. A partnership. A love match that had started with lies and become something true. During dinner, Lady Morrison asked Lydia about her plans now that she was settled. "Plans," Lydia repeated. "Well, yes. The Duchess has always been quite active in charitable work, parliamentary support, social reform. Surely you have ideas about how you'd like to contribute." It was the first time anyone had asked Lydia what she wanted to do rather than who she wanted to be. And sitting there, with Adrian beside her and her family's future secure and society's respect finally earned, Lydia realized she had a platform now. Power. Resources. She could actually make a difference. "I have several ideas," she said. "I'd like to establish a fund for families facing financial hardship, education programs for young women, medical access for those who can't afford care." Adrian's hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently. "That sounds wonderful," Lady Morrison said. "I'm sure the Duchess would be happy to help you organize it." Later, in the carriage home, Adrian was quiet in that thoughtful way that meant he was processing something important. "What?" Lydia asked. "You're going to change things," he said. "Really change them. You've already changed how society sees marriages of convenience. Now you're going to change how they see charity and support and women's education." "Is that bad?" "That's extraordinary." He pulled her close. "I married you thinking I was rescuing you from ruin. Turns out you're the one who's going to reshape London society." Lydia laughed. "That's a bit dramatic." "Is it? You've already defeated Catherine, won over the ton, and now you're planning social reform. What's next? Parliament?" "Don't tempt me." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Lydia realized something had shifted. She wasn't performing anymore, wasn't pretending or calculating or trying to be invisible. She was just herself. And that was enough. More than enough. "Adrian," she said quietly. "I love you. Really love you. Not because it's strategic or because we're married or because it makes sense. It's just because I do." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. "I know," he said against her lips. "I've known since the night you told off Catherine at the auction. Maybe even before that." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you needed to figure it out for yourself. You needed to choose this without pressure, without performance, without anyone, including me, telling you what to feel." He smiled. "But I'm glad you figured it out. I'm glad you chose me." "Every day," Lydia repeated her earlier promise. "I choose you every day." The carriage pulled up to their house, their home, and they climbed out together. In the windows above, lamplight glowed warm and welcoming. Inside, servants were preparing the house for the night, turning down beds and banking fires. It was ordinary, domestic, the kind of comfortable routine that Lydia had watched other people build and thought she'd never have. But she had it now. Had built it from lies and desperation and a fake engagement that had become the realest thing in her life. Adrian paused at the door, turning to face her in the lamplight. "What?" she asked. "Nothing. I just wanted to look at you." His expression was soft. "My wife. My Duchess. My partner. Still can't quite believe you're real." "I'm real. This is real." Lydia stood on her toes, kissing him gently. "And it's ours." They went inside together, closing the door on the street, on society's expectations, on everything they'd been before. The woman no one chose had been chosen. The strategic arrangement had become a love match. The lie had transformed into truth. And standing in the entrance hall with Adrian's hand in hers, Lydia felt something she hadn't felt in 18 months. Hope. Not for survival, but for something far greater. For a future built not on necessity, but on choice. For love that was messy and complicated and absolutely wonderfully real. 6 months into their marriage, Lydia discovered she was surprisingly good at being a duchess. Not the ceremonial parts. Those still felt like performance half the time. But the actual work of it, the organizing and strategizing and managing a household that employed dozens of people and controlled vast estates, that came naturally. She'd spent 18 months calculating survival down to the penny. Running ducal finances was the same skill, just with more zeros. Adrian found her in his study one morning, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, making notes in the margins of a proposal for tenant housing improvements. "You've reorganized my entire filing system," he observed. "Your filing system was chaos. How did you find anything?" "With difficulty." He leaned over her shoulder, reading her notes. "These are good suggestions. Have you been studying estate management? I've been reading your library. You have 17 books on agricultural reform and about 30 on economic theory. They're surprisingly interesting once you get past the terrible writing." Lydia marked another passage. "Did you know we're losing money on the northern estate because the irrigation system is 50 years outdated? Fix that, and crop yields could increase by 30%. Adrian was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked. "Nothing. Just, you've been married to me for 6 months, and you've already identified inefficiencies my estate manager has been missing for years. Your estate manager is 70 and set in his ways. Someone needed to look at things with fresh eyes. And that someone is you. Is that a problem?" Lydia set down her pen. "If you'd rather I stay out of estate business..." "No, I'd rather you take over half of it because you're clearly better at this than I am." Adrian pulled up a chair beside her. "Show me what else you found." They spent the next 2 hours going through accounts together, Lydia pointing out inefficiencies and Adrian asking questions that pushed her thinking further. It was the kind of partnership they'd stumbled into without planning, complementary strengths, mutual respect, genuine collaboration. At some point, their discussion of crop rotation turned into an argument about tariff policy, which somehow became a debate about Lydia's charitable foundation plans. By the time Adrian's secretary knocked to remind him of a parliamentary meeting, they'd covered everything from tenant welfare to international trade. "We should do this more often," Adrian said, gathering his papers. "You see things I miss. You listen to things I say. That's rarer than you think." He kissed her forehead. "I'll be back for dinner. Try not to reorganize the entire household while I'm gone." No promises. After he left, Lydia returned to her correspondence. Among the usual invitations and charity requests was a letter that made her pause. The handwriting was familiar, though she hadn't seen it in months. Catherine Willoughby. Lydia almost threw it away unread. Then curiosity won. The letter was brief and surprisingly humble. Catherine was writing to apologize for her behavior, to admit that jealousy had driven her to action she now regretted. She didn't ask for forgiveness exactly, just acknowledged the harm she'd caused and wished Lydia well. It was probably sincere. It was also irrelevant. Lydia had stopped caring about Catherine's opinion the night she'd turned Catherine's attack into a triumph. But she appreciated the gesture, so she wrote a brief response accepting the apology and suggesting they both move forward. Then she returned to her estate management proposals and forgot about Catherine entirely. That evening, Eleanor arrived for dinner unannounced, which meant she wanted something. "You're looking well," Eleanor said, accepting wine from a servant. "Marriage suits you." "Thank you. What do you want?" Eleanor laughed. "Direct as always." "Very well. I want you to host the annual Ravenscroft Charity Gala." Lydia blinked. "The what?" "The Charity Gala. It's been a tradition for 40 years. I hosted it until Adrian's father died, then continued hosting for Adrian. But I'm stepping back from public events, and as the current Duchess, the responsibility falls to you." "You're asking me to organize one of London's largest social events with..." Lydia checked the calendar on Adrian's desk. 6 weeks of preparation? 5 weeks, actually. The date's already set. Eleanor's smile was sharp. "Think of it as a test.
Can the unconventional Duchess who married for practical reasons handle the most scrutinized social event of the season? It was a challenge, possibly a trap, definitely an opportunity. "What's the budget?" Lydia asked.
Eleanor named a figure that made Lydia's head spin. Then she added, "Though I suspect you'll find ways to make it more efficient. You have a talent for that." After Eleanor left, Adrian found Lydia in the library, staring at nothing. "My mother roped you into hosting the gala, didn't she?" "How did you know?" "Because she's been planning to pass it off to you for weeks. She thinks you'll either succeed spectacularly or fail publicly, and she's curious which." Adrian sat beside her. "You don't have to do it. We could cancel, claim scheduling conflicts, and let everyone think I'm not capable of handling ducal responsibilities." Lydia shook her head. "No, I'm doing this. I'm just trying to figure out how." "You'll be brilliant at it. You're brilliant at everything you decide to do." "That's not true. I'm terrible at embroidery, and I still can't remember half the people we meet at parties." "Neither can I. I make up names sometimes and hope no one notices." Adrian pulled her against his side. "Want help planning? Want to be my partner in potential social disaster?" "Always." They spent the next 5 weeks in controlled chaos. Lydia discovered that organizing a charity gala for 500 guests was like managing a military campaign. There were seating charts that required delicate political navigation, menu selections that had to accommodate dietary restrictions, and social hierarchies, entertainment that needed to be impressive but not ostentatious. She threw herself into it with the same strategic focus she'd used for survival. Made lists, delegated ruthlessly, found efficiencies in the budget that let her redirect funds to actual charity rather than decorative excess. Adrian helped where he could, but his parliamentary work was intensifying. There was a major reform bill coming up for vote, and he was one of the primary advocates. Some nights, he didn't come home until after midnight, exhausted and frustrated by political maneuvering. "Lord Pemberton is blocking the bill," he said one night, collapsing into bed. "He's got enough support to kill it before it reaches a vote." "Why?" "Because it threatens his financial interests. The reforms would close loopholes his investments depend on." Adrian rubbed his face. "I've tried reasoning with him. I've tried negotiation. Nothing's working." Lydia was quiet for a moment, thinking, what if I talked to Lady Pemberton? His wife? Why would that help? Because Lady Pemberton controls the social calendar, and her support is more valuable to Lord Pemberton than any financial loophole. If I could convince her that supporting this reform would benefit their social standing, Lydia trailed off, working through the strategy. "It's worth trying." Adrian looked at her like she'd just solved an impossible equation. "You're suggesting social manipulation to achieve political reform. I'm suggesting strategic relationship building to create mutual benefit. There's a difference. Not much of one, but an important one." Lydia turned to face him fully. "Adrian, I spent 18 months being powerless. Now I have power, social connections, the Duchess title, resources. I want to use them for something that matters. You already are. The charitable foundation, the tenant improvements, those are important, but this is bigger. This reform could help thousands of people." She caught his hand. "Let me try. What's the worst that happens? Lady Pemberton says no, and we're exactly where we are now." Adrian studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled. "You're not the woman I thought I was marrying. Is that good or bad?" "It's extraordinary." He kissed her. "Talk to Lady Pemberton. See what you can do." Lydia arranged tea with Lady Pemberton under the pretense of discussing the upcoming gala. They met in the Pemberton drawing room, surrounded by expensive furniture and uncomfortable formality. "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton greeted her warmly. "How lovely to see you. I've been hearing such wonderful things about your charitable work." They discussed the gala, the weather, Margaret's upcoming debut season. Lydia waited until the conversation had settled into comfortable rhythm before shifting direction. "I wanted to ask your advice about something," she said carefully. "My husband is quite passionate about this reform bill coming up for vote, but I'm concerned about the political tensions it's creating. I'd hate to see long-standing relationships damaged over policy disagreements." Lady Pemberton's expression shifted, became more guarded. "You're referring to my husband's opposition." "I'm referring to the fact that intelligent people can disagree about complex issues, but I wonder if there isn't a solution that serves everyone's interests." Lydia set down her teacup. "What if Lord Pemberton supported the reform,
but with amendments that protected legitimate business interests while closing the most harmful loopholes. My husband believes the entire bill is overreach.
Your husband is positioning himself against popular reform that has significant public support. That's politically dangerous.
Lydia's voice was gentle, but firm.
But if you were to lead the effort to amend and improve the bill, he'd be seen as a statesman rather than an obstructionist. His legacy would be as someone who shaped important reform, not someone who tried to block it.
Lady Pemberton was quiet for a long moment.
You're very strategic for someone so young. I'm practical, and I care about your family's standing as much as I care about this reform passing. Lydia leaned forward. Help me find a compromise. Help your husband become the hero of this story rather than the villain. It took another hour of careful negotiation, but Lady Pemberton eventually agreed to speak with her husband. 3 days later, Lord Pemberton requested a meeting with Adrian to discuss potential amendments.
The bill passed 2 weeks later with modifications that satisfied most parties. Adrian came home that night looking exhausted and elated. "We did it," he said, pulling Lydia into his arms. "The reform passed. People are actually going to benefit from this. You did it. I just helped remove an obstacle."
You completely changed the political landscape. Pemberton's already claiming credit for improving the bill, which is exactly what you predicted. Adrian laughed. You're a better political strategist than half of Parliament. I'm a Duchess who understands that power isn't about force. It's about finding what people want and helping them get it. Where did you learn that?
From you, from Eleanor, from 18 months of having no power and learning to survive anyway. Lydia rested her head against his chest. I'm just applying those lessons to a bigger playing field. The night of the charity gala arrived with terrifying speed.
Lydia spent the entire day managing last-minute crises, a missing floral arrangement, a musician who fell ill, a seating dispute that nearly escalated into a social incident. By the time guests started arriving, she was exhausted and running on pure determination. Adrian found her in their bedroom, struggling with a necklace clasp. Here, he said, taking over. Breathe. Everything's going to be fine. The Ashworths are seated next to the Morrisons, who haven't spoken in 3 years. The ice sculpture is melting faster than anticipated, and I just learned that the prince himself might attend, which means we need to completely reorganize the reception line. The prince is definitely attending. He confirmed this morning. I forgot to mention it. Adrian finished with the necklace. Sorry. Lydia turned to stare at him. The prince. You forgot to mention the prince. I've been distracted by parliamentary work. It slipped my mind. He looked genuinely apologetic. Can you handle it? Could she handle it? She was about to host the most scrutinized social event of the season with royalty in attendance and half of London watching for her to fail. Yes, Lydia said, I can handle it. The gala was magnificent. Lydia greeted 500 guests with perfect grace, navigated the prince's attendance without visible panic, and managed to make every person feel welcomed and valued. The food was excellent, the entertainment impressive, the charity auction raised 3 times the expected amount. And when Eleanor approached her near midnight, Lydia was riding high on the success. Well done, Eleanor said quietly. You've exceeded every expectation. Thank you, that means more than you know. Does it? Eleanor's expression was knowing. You don't need my approval anymore, Lydia. You've established yourself independent of my manipulation. You're not the desperate woman who accepted my bargain. You're the Duchess of Ravenscroft in your own right. It was true. Somewhere in the past 6 months, Lydia had stopped performing the role and started inhabiting it. She wasn't pretending to be a duchess, she was one. I should probably thank you, Lydia said. Your scheme gave me opportunities I never would have had otherwise. My scheme was supposed to benefit Adrian. Instead, it benefited you both in ways I didn't anticipate. Eleanor's smile was almost genuine. You're better for my son than anyone I could have chosen for him through conventional means. Your unconventional beginning made you perfect for each other. It was the closest Eleanor would ever come to admitting she'd been wrong. Lydia appreciated it anyway. Later, when the last guest had departed and the staff was cleaning up, Lydia found Adrian on the terrace, looking out over the garden. Successful evening, he said when she joined him. Exhausting evening. I never want to organize another event that large ever again. You'll have to. It's annual. But he was smiling. You were incredible tonight. The prince himself commented on how impressive you were. The prince was being polite. The prince doesn't do polite. He was genuinely impressed. Adrian pulled her close. So am I. You've transformed yourself from invisible debutante to influential duchess in less than a year. That's extraordinary. Lydia thought about the woman she'd been a year ago. Desperate, calculating, willing to accept any bargain that promised survival, that woman would barely recognize who Lydia had become. I couldn't have done it without you, she said. Yes, you could have. You would have found another way, another path. You're too resilient not to. Adrian's voice was soft. But I'm grateful you chose this path. Chose me. Every day, Lydia said, repeating her promise. I choose you every day. They stood together in the cool night air, and Lydia felt something settle in her chest. Contentment, maybe. Or just the quiet satisfaction of having built something real from impossible circumstances. 3 months later, Lydia's charitable foundation officially launched. The event was smaller than the gala, but no less significant. 20 organizations that supported women's education, medical access, and financial literacy. A fund that would provide emergency assistance to families facing ruin, the kind of assistance Lydia's family had desperately needed 18 months ago. She stood in front of the assembled guests, many of them women who'd experienced their own financial struggles, and spoke without notes. I was asked to give a speech about why this foundation matters, she began. But I think the answer is simple. 18 months ago, my family faced complete ruin. We had no options, no resources, no way forward. I was lucky. I found a path to survival, though it looked nothing like I expected. She glanced at Adrian, who was watching from the front row. But most people don't get lucky. Most people facing what my family faced simply fail. They lose everything. Their homes, their dignity, their futures. This foundation exists to make sure that doesn't happen. To provide resources and support and second chances to people who deserve them. The applause was genuine and sustained. After the speech, Lydia spent hours talking with fund recipients, hearing their stories, learning what they needed. It was exhausting and humbling and exactly what she wanted to be doing. Margaret found her near the end of the event. You did it, her sister said, hugging her. You actually did it. Did what? Turn disaster into power. You've changed everything. For our family, for yourself, for all these people you're helping. Margaret pulled back, smiling. I'm so proud of you. I learned from the best. You've been holding our family together while I've been playing Duchess. You're not playing, you are the Duchess, and you're using it to actually matter. Margaret's expression turned thoughtful. Do you ever think about where you'd be if Eleanor hadn't made that offer? If you'd said no? Lydia had thought about it. Late at night, she sometimes wondered what would have happened if she'd refused Eleanor's bargain. If she'd chosen pride over survival. We'd have lost everything, she said honestly. The house, mother's medical care, your prospects. Father would have been destroyed by it. We'd have disappeared into poverty and obscurity. Instead, you're changing London society. I'm trying. Small steps that lead somewhere important. Margaret squeezed her hand. The woman you've become. I don't think that person would have existed without everything you went through, the desperation, the fake engagement, all of it. It made you. Maybe Margaret was right. Maybe the woman Lydia had become could only exist because of the desperation that had driven her to accept Eleanor's bargain. The performance that had taught her how to navigate power. The love that had grown from lies. That evening, alone with Adrian in their library, Lydia finally asked the question she'd been avoiding. Do you ever regret how we started? The lies, the manipulation, all of it? Adrian looked up from his papers. That's a complicated question. I know, but I need to know. He set aside his work, giving her his full attention. I regret that my mother put us both in an impossible position. I regret that we didn't meet under normal circumstances. But do I regret the outcome? Do I regret being married to you? He shook his head. Not for a second. Even though it started as a lie, it started as a transaction. It became truth. Adrian moved to sit beside her. Lydia, I don't care how we began. I care about who we are now, about the partnership we've built, the life we're creating together. That's what matters. What if people always see us as the couple who married under false pretenses? Then they're not paying attention, because anyone who's watched us over the past year knows this marriage is real. He caught her hand. Stop worrying about perception. Start enjoying what we have. It was good advice. Lydia tried to follow it. The following spring brought Margaret's debut season, sponsored by the Duchess of Ravenscroft, with all the resources and connections that implied. Lydia watched her sister navigate society with the same strategic intelligence Lydia had developed, but without the desperation that had driven Lydia's choices. Margaret had options. She could choose for love or position or simple compatibility because Lydia had ensured she'd never face the kind of financial desperation that had defined Lydia's own choices. "You're staring," Adrian observed one night at a ball where Margaret was surrounded by admirers. "I'm protecting my investment. If any of those young men hurt her, I'll destroy them socially." "That's very Duchess of you."
"I'm learning from the best." Lydia watched Margaret laugh at something a young earl said. "She's going to be fine. Better than fine. Because of you. Because she's brilliant and resilient and had the advantage of not having to marry in desperation." Lydia turned to Adrian. "Do you think we would have married if circumstances had been different? If we'd met at a party, been properly introduced, had time to court normally?"
Adrian considered this question seriously. "I think I would have noticed you, would have been intrigued by your intelligence and your refusal to be impressed by my title. But would I have pursued you?" He paused. "Probably not. I was too guarded, too convinced I didn't need anyone. And I would have been too invisible for you to see me properly, too focused on survival to risk vulnerability. So maybe the circumstances that brought us together were the only circumstances that could have worked." Adrian pulled her onto the dance floor. "Maybe we needed the lies to find the truth." It was a romantic notion, probably too romantic for their practical, strategic foundation. But as they moved through the waltz together, Lydia found she wanted to believe it anyway. 1 year exactly from their rushed wedding, Adrian surprised her with a trip to the chapel where they'd married. "What are we doing here?" Lydia asked. "Renewing vows. Properly this time. Just us. No witnesses. No pressure." He took her hands. "A year ago, we stood here out of desperation and fear. I want to stand here again and choose you out of love and certainty." It was the most romantic thing he'd ever done. Also slightly absurd since they were already married and vows didn't need renewing. But Lydia understood what he was offering: a do-over, a chance to say the words meaning them completely, without Catherine's threat hanging over them or Eleanor's manipulation pushing them forward. "I, Adrian Vale, take you, Lydia Halevale, as my wife," Adrian said quietly. "Not because circumstances forced us together, not because it's strategic or practical or beneficial, but because you're the most extraordinary person I've ever met, and I can't imagine my life without you." Lydia felt tears streaming down her face. "I, Lydia Vale, take you, Adrian Vale, as my husband, because you saw me when I was invisible, because you respected me when I had nothing, because you've been my partner in every sense that matters." They kissed in the empty chapel, and it felt like a beginning rather than an anniversary. Like they were finally choosing each other free from all the complications that had defined their beginning. When they emerged, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. "So," Adrian said, "now what?" "Now we go home," Lydia said. "We keep building what we've started. We keep choosing each other. Every day?" "Every day." They walked back to the carriage together, and Lydia thought about the journey that had brought them here. The desperate bargain, the public performances, the rushed wedding, the slow transformation from survival strategy to genuine partnership. None of it had been easy. Most of it had been terrifying, but it had also been worth it. 5 years later, Lydia stood in the same library where she'd once reorganized Adrian's filing system, looking at the latest report from her charitable foundation. They'd helped 300 families avoid the kind of ruin the Hales had faced, provided education to 200 young women, funded medical care for dozens of people who couldn't afford it. Small victories, she'd once thought. But they added up to something significant. Adrian found her there, their 3-year-old daughter balanced on his hip. Catherine, named not for Willoughby but for Adrian's grandmother, was babbling about something incomprehensible and delightful. "She wants to know if you're coming to tea," Adrian translated. "Tea with stuffed animals is very important business. I'll be right there." Lydia set aside the report. Later, after Catherine had been put to bed and they were alone again, Adrian asked, "Happy?" It was a simple question, but Lydia took time to consider it seriously. Was she happy? The woman she'd been, desperate, invisible, calculating survival, would barely recognize her life now. The Duchess, who influenced political reform and ran charitable foundations and had actual power to create change. The wife who'd built a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine love. The mother raising a daughter who would never know financial desperation or social invisibility. Yes, Lydia said. Surprisingly, completely yes. Why surprisingly? Because happiness wasn't what I was looking for when I accepted your mother's bargain. I was looking for survival. Everything else was bonus. Adrian pulled her close. I'm glad survival came with benefits. The best benefits. Lydia rested against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Do you ever tell Catherine about how we met? I tell her we met under unusual circumstances and fell in love anyway. The details can wait until she's older. Much older. Definitely much older. They sat in comfortable silence, and Lydia felt the accumulated weight of 5 years of marriage, of partnership, of choosing each other repeatedly settle around them like a blanket. The lie they'd told everyone else had become the truth they lived. The fake engagement had transformed into the realest relationship either of them had known. The woman no one chose had become someone who mattered, not because of her title or her marriage, but because of what she'd built with those tools. Years later, when historians wrote about the social reforms of the period, they would mention the Duchess of Ravenscroft's charitable foundation. They would note her influence on political discussions, her quiet but effective advocacy for women's education and financial literacy. They wouldn't know about the desperate bargain that had started it all, about Eleanor's manipulation or Catherine's blackmail, or the rushed wedding that had saved 2 people from social destruction. Those details were lost to history, known only to the handful of people who'd been directly involved. But Lydia would always remember, would always know that everything she'd become, the Duchess, the reformer, the woman who mattered, had started with the most desperate, reckless decision of her life. She'd chosen survival over pride, strategy over safety, partnership over isolation. And from that choice, built on lies and desperation and theatrical performance, had grown something genuine and powerful and absolutely true. Sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, Lydia would stand at the window of their bedroom and look out over London. At the city that had first ignored her, then judged her, then finally accepted her as someone worth paying attention to. She'd conquered it, not through birth or beauty or conventional means, but through intelligence and resilience and the willingness to take extraordinary risks when circumstances demanded it. The woman no one chose had become the woman everyone wanted to know. The invisible debutante had become a force that shaped society. The desperate liar had become someone who wielded truth as power. And it had all started with a single, impossible choice: to accept Eleanor's bargain and step into a lie that would become her life. Adrian would find her at the window, wrap his arms around her from behind, and ask what she was thinking about. And Lydia would smile and say, "Everything. Nothing. How far we've come." Any regrets? Not a single one. It was true. Every hardship, every performance, every moment of fear and uncertainty had led her here, to a life she'd never imagined, built from circumstances she'd never wanted, with a partner she'd never expected to love. They said that desperate times called for desperate measures, but sometimes desperate measures led to extraordinary outcomes. Sometimes survival became power. Sometimes lies became truth. And sometimes the woman no one chose became exactly who she was always meant to be, not despite the desperate beginning, but because of it. Lydia Hale Vale, Duchess of Ravenscroft, had learned that lesson better than anyone. She'd been ignored, underestimated, written off as irrelevant, and she'd used that invisibility as a weapon, that desperation as fuel, that impossible bargain as foundation for something far greater than anyone, including herself, had imagined. She hadn't just survived, she dominated, not through force or manipulation or inherited power, but through intelligence and strategy and the willingness to transform weakness into strength. And standing at her window, looking out over a city she'd conquered, with the man she loved sleeping behind her and the future bright with possibility ahead, Lydia finally understood what Eleanor had known from the beginning. The woman who could survive the impossible could do anything. The woman who could turn lies into truth could reshape the world. The woman who chose survival over pride could become unstoppable. Lydia had been that woman all along. She just needed the right circumstances, The desperate bargain, the fake engagement, the rushed wedding, to discover it. And now, 5 years later, with power and influence and purpose she'd built from nothing, Lydia understood the greatest truth of all. She hadn't been saved by the bargain. She'd saved herself. The bargain had just given her the opportunity to prove what she'd always been capable of, if anyone had bothered to look. Now everyone was looking, and they would never look away again.